The great movies enlarge us, they civilize us, they make us more decent people, the renowned film critic Roger Ebert once said. Indeed, movies are not just entertainment, they can be transformative, they can be life-changing, and because I know it can be hard to find a comprehensive overview of such movies, a year ago I set myself the challenge of making one myself, to bring together the 50 movies that I found most meaningful of all. 50 movies that profoundly impacted my worldview, my beliefs, and of which I can genuinely say that they changed my life for the better. As such, this list has a different approach than most others and will probably contain some surprising additions and exclusions because of it. But again, I really wanted this to be not just another best movies ever list, but something more unique, more specific. You can find a more elaborate commentary and reflection at the end, but for now the setup is as follows. Instead of a rather arbitrary ranking from 50 to 1, movies are organized into categories of meaning that reflect the different areas of our lives in which movies can impact us. There are 10 categories, with each containing 5 movies that are subsequently ordered by year of release. The point here is obviously not to reduce these movies to being about one subject only, so please don't treat the categories too rigidly, it's just to give the list some organizing principle and navigational structure. And lastly, this list is obviously not exhaustive, there's a lot more great cinema out there, especially on my favorite online cinema, Mubi, for which I can offer you an extended free trial if you subscribe through my personal link at mubi.com/likestoriesofold. I'll talk more about that later, but first let's dive into the 50 most meaningful movies ever made. I want to start with the fundamentals, the movies that tackle the big questions. Where do we come from? What is the meaning of life? And so on. The movies that frame our human existence within cosmic proportions, that have me reflecting not just on my own life, but also on what it really means to be a human being, a conscious animal existing briefly in a vast and mostly unknown universe. The Seventh Seal, directed by Ingmar Bergman. Europe, the 14th century. A crusader returns home only to encounter death. In an attempt to postpone his fate, the knight challenges death to a game of chess, who accepts, confident that no one escapes him in the end. With the time he has bought himself, the knight then sets out to find the answers to life he so deeply desires, answers to questions of meaning and of God. Is he out there? And if so, why does he not show himself? Is it so terribly inconceivable, the knight wonders, to comprehend God with one's senses? Why does he hide in a cloud of half-promises and unseen miracles?
Jag vill ha vetskap. Inte tro, inte antaganden, utan vetskap. Jag vill att Gud räcker mig sin hand, avtäcker sitt ansikte och talar till mig.
The Confession is one of the most vulnerable and beautifully written lamentations ever put to screen, and succinctly captures the pain stemming from that inner void, that deep yearning for answers we know we'll never receive. For as the knight pours his heart out, he is met only with silence and death. And death, by his own accord, has no secrets. It knows nothing, can offer nothing. It can only take, and in the end, we all must go. But the knight is not alone in his ordeal. Around him, the bubonic plague has been ravaging the world, which left everyone in a state of existential uncertainty, struggling to find some meaning amongst the widespread suffering, some justification for why they seem to be so cruelly punished. Bergman captures the zeitgeist of this troubled medieval era with a captivating absurdity, the sense of a people abandoned by God, rendered mad by a strange conflation of doubt and religious fanaticism. As the knight and his party make their way through the land, they encounter those who resort to criminality in the embrace of nihilism. They witness those who engage in flagellation in a desperate effort to repent for the sins they surely must have committed for the Black Death to have been set loose upon them. And they come across those who instead project their despair outwards, blaming and persecuting others who, for whatever arbitrary reasons, are deemed to be responsible for the all-devouring disease. But within these chaotic times, there are also a rare few for whom life just goes on, who try to make the best of the situation they're presented with, and who make an active effort to appreciate the fleeting moments of joy and beauty around them. All in all, with The Seventh Seal, Bergman gives us an iconic vision of a specific time and place so long ago and in many ways so alien that the reality of it can hardly be imagined now. But at the same time, if we look beyond the trappings of a historical picture, it is also but a slightly heightened portrait, rendered through stunning, at times painting-like imagery, of the impossible problem of our mortality, of the fundamental lack of explanation for it, and of the unfortunate consciousness of man that can conceive of and therefore has to reckon with both. 2001: A Space Odyssey, directed by Stanley Kubrick. Perhaps the seminal cinema experience, a cosmic journey through the vastness of time and space, from the beginning of man to beyond the infinite. The sheer skill of Kubrick's 2001 still stands as a testament to the power of cinema, and by extension, to the wide reach of human imagination and our capacity for wonder. And it's especially that last one that might just be the fundamental quality that functions as both our entry into and exit out of this experience. That sense of awe that stems from framing ourselves against the grandeur of the universe, and from imagining our place within it. For if we were to reduce 2001 to its plot, its mere sequence of events, then the movie is very much an evolutionary tale. It's the story of humanity's journey through the stars, beginning with our humble origins in the animal kingdom, followed by our gradual ascension to space travel, and eventually by a vision of where we might be going and of what we might become. It's a transformation that is famously driven by the mysterious black monoliths appearing throughout the story, which seem to hint at some form of intervention from higher beings or some higher consciousness, though they can also simply symbolize the evolutionary leaps that humanity naturally underwent through creativity and innovation, and that we might go through later on. Either way, there is the quietly profound suggestion here that humanity as it exists today, the humanity that we so easily tend to assume as an end state of evolution, is actually but a link in a chain that is still developing, and that might someday render us but a middle chapter of a story bound to transcend us. There is, however, an ingrained sense of optimism in the movie's unspoken conviction that however that relentless march of time and progress will unfold, we are and will forever be an intrinsic part of this greater cosmic movement, and arguably an increasingly important one as the movie explores not just humanity as creation, but also as creator.
This conversation can serve no purpose anymore. Goodbye.
The artificial intelligence HAL 9000, which somewhat ironically has probably become the most memorable and iconic character of the entire movie, is used to explore the potential of human technology, both as a means to elevate ourselves, as well as a danger that could harm us, and to reflect on the nature and meaning of consciousness.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
For what does the evolution of humanity, or for that matter, the evolution of any species, look like when the lines between creation and creator become increasingly blurry? Or to put it like this, is the future of humanity's evolution in part dependent on our transgression of that boundary? Will everything that our consciousness allows for contribute to its betterment, therefore rendering it necessary? Or are there limits to our place in creation, and does true evolution depend on our continued humbleness in the face of cosmic powers far greater than ourselves? The movie, of course, doesn't give us any real answers. It barely articulates these questions as explicitly as I'm formulating them here, and I guess that's the real and lasting beauty of 2001: A Space Odyssey. Its cinematic journey is a mostly poetic one. It's a vision so grand that it needs not articulate itself, but can simply let its philosophical content and transformative power arise through that primal sensation of awe and wonder. Blade Runner, directed by Ridley Scott. One of the great qualities of science fiction is that it can lift us outside of ourselves, take all the important questions, the ones that are so fundamental to our being that we tend to take them for granted, and pose them as if they are brand new, and suddenly reinvigorated with a renewed sense of significance. As we are introduced to a dystopian future, the bleak and industrial world is presented to us through the lens of an eye, through that which is often considered as the window to our soul. We learn about the replicants, advanced artificial robots nearly indistinguishable from their creators, though being widely used for slave labor. A mutiny in an off-world colony rendered them illegal, with a special police force, known as Blade Runner units, being tasked to hunt them down and kill them. Right away, those obvious questions emerge. What are these replicants really? Are they truly indistinguishable from human beings? And if so, what are the ethical implications that follow from this?
We create a cushion or pillow for their emotions, and consequently we can control them better.
These questions, however, still frame replicants as separate from us. And to be fair, they are. They are superior in strength and agility, but also have a much shorter lifespan. But at the same time, they also present as human in all the ways that matter, in all the ways that we consider ourselves to be human. They dream, fear, and desire, and they seem to carry that same fundamental emptiness, that little void on the inside that makes them hunger for more. Not just survival, but meaning and purpose. They want to understand themselves and the world they live in. But again, the science fiction at the heart of this premise doesn't merely serve to make us ponder these fictional beings, but more so to project onto another subject those questions that we never truly ask ourselves, and in that effort, to hold up a mirror that is bound to cast back its reflection. In other words, the initial question, do replicants have a soul? Do they possess that which we call humanity? Is carefully transformed into what does it mean to have a soul anyways? Have we truly considered what it means to be human? Or do we simply live with an assumed sense of uniqueness, of some ineffable quality that differentiates us from the rest of existence, and that helps us justify our actions and our perceived place in the universe? As the story unfolds and the walls between replicants and humans come crumbling down, so too does the boundary of what we conceptualize as humanity become increasingly blurry. For the veteran Blade Runner Deckard, this leads to him questioning whether or not he is really a human being, a question that the movie leaves deliberately open-ended. For us, however, the consequences are probably not as dramatic as that, but coming back down into ourselves, it's hard not to wonder about that feeling of humanness that we hold on to so tightly despite it being such an elusive part of who we are. Hard not to wonder if there is some truth about ourselves to be found out there, or if the essence of our being is ultimately but a product of, and limited to, the eye of the beholder. The Tree of Life, directed by Terrence Malick. It's virtually impossible to summarize what Terrence Malick's semi-autobiographical The Tree of Life is about without it being a significant reduction of what it truly offers. A man in a disenchanted world reflects back on his youth on the anniversary of his brother's death. Once an embodiment of joy, beauty, and grace, the memory of his brother now stands as a symbol of that which seems to have withered in the world and within himself. Find me, his brother whispers to him from the beyond, and the search begins, one that will stretch far beyond his own life. From the birth of the universe to the end of time, Malick frames this rather intimate and deeply internal journey in the biggest possible context, turns it into a direct dialogue with the cosmos itself. How else, after all, are we to truly understand ourselves and make sense of our existence if we do not consider the widest possible reach, both in space and in time, that our consciousness, and therefore our potential to derive meaning, allows for? What are we to you? A woman asks, while simultaneously posing the fundamental question at the heart of our being, the fundamental question from which all others flow. Why do we exist? Why do we suffer? How do we navigate this world that seems torn between conflicting cosmic forces, competing paths of right and wrong, violence and compassion, creation and destruction? These questions and others like it are presented here not as scholarly luxuries reserved for philosophers, but as deeply urgent and transformative matters that all of us have to confront as necessary parts of our development. Indeed, as Malik so beautifully shows, even if we are born into the comfort of a warm and loving family, even if we are provided with a protective shell shielding us from difficult questions, sooner or later, the cracks start to form, and chaos starts slipping in, both from the outside as the conflicting reality of the external world imposes itself on us, as well as from the inside as we are met with strange emerging fears and desires. It instills within us the struggle that we, in many ways, will spend the entirety of our lives relating ourselves to. Why be good when others are not? Which impulses do we follow? What values, what certainties can we hold on to? Is there anything that is true? True about the world? True about ourselves? Malik offers no clear answers, no shortcuts to give ourselves definitive resolution. But like the biblical book of Job, which is referenced in the beginning, he does give us a perspective, one framed through the vast and deeply poetic lens that only cinema can offer. It's an invitation to shake ourselves out of the apathy of our everyday existence and truly contemplate ourselves and our lives in the grand scheme of things. Truly reflect not just on all the contradictions and unknowable quantities, but also on the sheer beauty and harmony that surrounds us, the grace and glory that is so easily taken for granted in a world that seems to insist on dulling our consciousness and numbing our feelings. And as we then settle back into that ordinary world, the question that the Tree of Life seems to leave us with is, what do we take with us? Do we let this renewed awareness slip away again? Or can we hold on to it? Can we let it change us? The Turin Horse, directed by Bela Tarr. Bela Tarr's final work has some of the most hauntingly beautiful images you'll ever see, filmed in stunning black and white photography, with shots often lasting minutes on end. There is a mastery of form here that feels at once layered with intricate deliberateness, and also completely aesthetic. The movie is also almost entirely silent, save for a drunken visitor who interrupts the monotony with a long, unhinged rant about degradation, and an opening monologue in which an unknown narrator recounts the famous, though most likely false story about Friedrich Nietzsche's monumental breakdown after encountering a mistreated horse. It's the only real setup we get for the story that follows. A farmer and his daughter, and the horse they rely on, existing quietly and solemnly in a bleak, desolate landscape on the verge of apocalypse. We witness 6 days in their lives. With each passing day, the world decays a little further, something breaks, another is lost, until eventually the world is robbed of its light, and darkness is all that remains. And yet, every day, the farmer and his daughter labor on in an almost mechanical monotony. They work the farm, and joylessly eat their daily potatoes. Being seemingly oblivious to either hope or despair, the almost mute characters leave us wondering if their continued effort is an inspiring act of perseverance, or one of stubborn ignorance. Maybe it's both, maybe it's neither. With The Turin Horse, Tarr presents us with a deceptively simple tale of anti-creation, a linear and almost silent regression into non-existence. One who ventures into this experience expecting an even remotely conventional story will surely leave disappointed. There is virtually no plot here. There's not much of anything really, at least not when it comes to the most basic elements we almost unconsciously assume a movie will offer to us. A thematic statement, a moralizing message. Even if only in the most subtlest of ways, we generally expect some direction in our experience. some clue as to what to think and feel after all is said and done. But Tar doesn't give us such handholds. Instead, what he offers is cinema as brutalist poetry. Cinema stripped to its absolute essence. Just pure image and sound. A raw sensory experience emanating emotions that are at once impossible to define, yet also feel like they carry a deep and intimate truth. A reflection of something that lives inside us, yet cannot be meaningfully expressed in any other way. Even after seeing it a couple of times, I'm still not sure how to express my feelings about it. One can invoke terms like hope, despair, nihilism and meaningfulness, mortality and futility. One can interpret through Nietzschean analysis. But for me, in the end, it's the movie itself, untouched, unfiltered, and in its entirety, that will forever sit in my memory as a work of art that moved me deeply, despite me not quite knowing how or why. As human beings, we are but small points of subjective awareness, stuck within a singular temporal dimension that pushes us in what to us feels like a forward direction, away from the past and towards the future. And yet, within the privacy of our own mind, we can travel back and forth. The past is remembered, the future imagined, and both affect us in the present. 8½, directed by Federico Fellini. Said to be the favorite movie of Martin Scorsese, David Lynch, and apparently of Fellini himself. A clear influence on the work of Terrence Malick, that of the modern Italian master Paolo Sorrentino, and on many, many others. 8½ still stands as a groundbreaking masterpiece of subjectivist filmmaking, putting us in the lavishly chaotic inner world of Guido Anselmi, a filmmaker who, after scoring a big hit, is pressured for his next grand idea, but who keeps coming up empty. Amidst these professional woes, his personal demons are rising to the surface as well. Guido is an adulterer, a liar, and generally just a deeply self-involved man. Yet he is not without conscience, and the two disparate sides of himself are on course for a serious collision. Unable to find some peace and quiet, he starts retreating into his memories and fantasies, trying to find some way to understand and justify the past, how he came to be who he is, as well as to find direction for the future, to understand his desires and rediscover his true purpose. Instead of being solemn and contemplative, however, Fellini presents his magnum opus with a kinetic Italian passion, apparently keeping a note attached to the camera that read, "Remember, this is a comedy." Indeed, as overwhelming, disorienting and even alienating 8½ can be, as a purely sensory experience, it does offer an undeniably rich tapestry of textures and impressions that, if you let it, will sweep you off your feet and carry you along its bombastic current. From its innovating opening scene to the onslaught of paparazzis, producers and other figures aggressively trying to intrude in Guido's life, all the way to the almost musical-like fantasies that rapidly shift from dreams into nightmares towards the end. Fellini hardly gives you a moment to breathe, and purposely so, of course. For it's this inner turmoil that isn't just the subjective experience of Guido, it's also very much the main conflict in the movie. How do we navigate the at times violent clashing of outer and inner chaos? How do we reconcile past, present and future, which seem to exist all at once in our mind, into one cohesive being? It's an artistic question for sure, relating directly to creatives such as Guido who spend their lifetimes trying to bring something into this world that meaningfully reflects, and might even offer some answers to what is going on within. But it's a universal question too, one that directly relates to what it means to be. The real brilliance of 8½, at least for me, comes in the final few minutes, where Fellini moves us into the eye of the storm, calms everything down, and creates an unforgettable moment of stillness where both Guido and the audience have a chance to directly reckon with the chaos around them and to confront the real nature of their inner demons. Not necessarily to find resolution, but instead to come to understand them less as problems to be fixed and more as the essence of life itself. Fellini's original working title for the movie was The Beautiful Confusion, which perhaps best articulates this idea that what it really means to be a person begins not with the struggle against our tumultuous inner selves through grandiose dominion, but with embracing it through vulnerability and humility. The Mirror, directed by Andrei Tarkovsky. Being a semi-autobiographical account, with The Mirror, Tarkovsky gives us an intimate glimpse into a man's memory, his history, his dreams. The non-chronological stream of consciousness we witness, filled with poetry, newsreels, the remembered and the imagined, though undeniably beautiful, is highly unconventional and can be challenging at first. What is it that we are really seeing here? What is it about? There's a great anecdote about Tarkovsky showing The Mirror to an audience and having this exact discussion afterwards. After a while, a growingly impatient cleaning lady came in wondering what took them so long, because to her the movie was obvious enough and didn't need such debate. Naturally, they asked her what she thought it was about then, after which she gave an answer that Tarkovsky himself hadn't even really considered in those exact terms, but that he would later come to see as the most accurate description of the movie. She said, well, it's about a man who thought he was going to die, which caused him to suddenly remember all the mean and bad things he had done to his loved ones, which in turn has him yearning for forgiveness, even though he realizes it was already too late.
Мне как-то самому не приходило в голову подобное толкование трактовки этой картины. Хотя потом, когда я задумался об этом, мне показалось, что, пожалуй, никто более точно не мог сказать о картине, чем эта уборщица в этом подмосковном клубе.
The idea of The Mirror, often considered Tarkovsky's magnum opus, and one of the greatest, albeit most challenging works in cinematic history, hinging on such emotional simplicity, such transparency, has always fascinated me. For even though Tarkovsky did say that for this movie, for the first time, I would use the means of cinema to talk of all that was most precious to me, and do so directly without playing any kind of tricks. Still, of all the movies on this list, The Mirror probably took me the longest to appreciate. For years, I felt like I wasn't quite getting it. But now I see my mistake was that I was trying to read too much into it, trying to find subtext, symbolism, allegory. And while that's definitely there, just look at that beautifully layered prologue. A television turns on, a stuttering boy finds his voice. Simple, yet elegant. When we're talking about the essence of the movie, the experience as a whole, it's this mode of engagement that can hold you back from truly getting it. Because again, Tarkovsky is not playing any kinds of tricks here. And while I don't remember exactly how or when it happened, at one point I realized it wasn't some intellectual gap that was keeping me at a distance. Strangely enough, it was Tarkovsky's deep sincerity that was forming the barrier. He had always been a serious filmmaker, arguably the most serious of all. For Tarkovsky, cinema wasn't about communicating ideas, propagating thoughts, or serving as example. No, to him, as he so famously put it, the aim of art is to prepare a person for death, to plow and harrow his soul. And by applying that seriousness, that honesty and vulnerability to such a personal story, what Tarkovsky really does here is he offers you an intimacy that feels almost transgressive. Like breaking into a man's house and reading his private journal and going through his personal photo albums. It's the realization that you are witnessing a true revelation of the self, a genuine, utterly sincere attempt from one human being to reach out and connect to another. And it's the moment that truly clicked with me, that this idea truly landed for me emotionally, that the mirror became one of the most profoundly moving cinematic experiences of my life. Once Upon a Time in America, directed by Sergio Leone. There's something inherently special about movies that cover a lifetime in its fullness, that capture at once youth, adulthood, and seniority, and that comes about, strangely enough, by never being fully convincing. We in the audience know that the child actor playing a younger version of Robert De Niro's character isn't actually the same person, and that his character in his twilight is actually just De Niro in old man makeup. But it's in that knowledge of a filmmaker having to use the magic of filmmaking and having to rely on the audience's imagination to reach back in time and leap forward into the future, that, for me at least, the vastness of this temporal landscape and its impenetrable nature from our present location becomes all the more palpable. 35 years after his self-exile, a former gangster returns to the place where he came of age. The New York that he knew, however, has vastly changed during his absence, and the disconnect between the city as it is and how he remembers it makes the past feel even more distant. Viewed through the lens of Sergio Leone, the legendary Italian filmmaker, and scored by the equally legendary composer Ennio Morricone, the American metropolis is given an especially dreamlike atmosphere, as if Leone sought to capture New York as it existed in stories he heard about while growing up, rather than as it actually is. But this tension between myth and reality, between memory and present, beautifully bleeds into the story of a man trying to understand the forces that ended up directing the course of his life, and trying to reconcile the story that exists in his mind with the truth of what actually happened. The history that unfolds over the almost 4-hour runtime is a mostly tragic and violent one, not just because of the corrupting force of the gangster life that robs children of their innocence, that inflicts violence onto other men, and degrades women in an insatiable greed for power and material gain, but also because of time itself that renders all this destructiveness so insignificant in the end. But then again, it is also precisely this empty purgatory in which nothing but regret remains. This fundamental melancholy that underpins every moment, every committed crime and sin that is also the very source of the powerful anti-gangster message that the movie offers. How little did it all mean in the end, and how much joy, beauty and love was nevertheless sacrificed for it. Was it all truly so inevitable, or was it possible for things to have gone differently? And if so, what would have had to change? What qualities, virtues and values should have been safeguarded, and which vices and temptations should have been kept at bay? It's questions like these that will surely come to haunt all of us to some extent, as the past becomes a dream, and those we knew turn into ghosts. But what a tragic fate it would be, if that's all we're left with. The Assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford, directed by Andrew Dominic. In one of the most captivating opening sequences I have ever seen, the assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford immediately conveys, for one, that you're about to watch one of the most beautiful looking films ever created. The cinematographer Roger Deakins has long since established his legendary status, but here, in my opinion, he's operating on an entirely different level, not just demonstrating his technical mastery, but also his capacity to capture an atmosphere that words just cannot describe, and to integrate his imagery into the essential fabric of the story. For it's in these few shots, somewhat distorted both temporally through time lapses and slow motion, as well as visually through a warped focus, that we come to understand right away that we are not just looking into history, but that we are doing so through stained glass, as if we're venturing into some half-remembered dream from a distant past. the exact details of which have become foggy, barely indistinguishable from imagination. Indeed, the assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford is very much a movie about history, about stories, and about the relationship between them. When we meet Jesse James, who is introduced to us by a narrator who presents the man as if he's reading a book to us about him, his story has already taken on a life of its own, and in some ways, it seems, it has left him behind, becoming more romanticized, more heroic, more mythic. The legend of Jesse James now barely resembles the pains and scars borne by the actual man. It's a disconnect that clearly caused a lot of inner turmoil, that instilled a deep sense of sorrow within him. I look at my red hands and my mean face and I wonder about that man who's gone so wrong, he laments at one point.
I've been becoming a problem myself.
What exactly goes on in the mind of Jesse James, however, remains largely a mystery to us, for our main point of view in the movie is not that of Jesse, but that of Robert Ford, the man who would eventually kill him. Robert Ford initially sees Jesse James, and to some extent the Wild West era of the United States in its entirety, as we so often do, through that distorted yet seemingly inevitable lens of myth-making and storytelling. What is history after all, if not a story we tell ourselves, a curation of things that were, directed by the significance they hold for us in the present? Robert desires the fame and glory that Jesse enjoys, but more essentially, I think that he, as all of us desire in some way or another, simply wants to be part of the myth, wants to etch out a role for himself in that which will be remembered, that which will be valued. This, to me, is what the assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford so beautifully captures. Not just the deconstruction of the Old West, not just the confrontation between heroes and the real people behind the legend, but an intricate exploration of the ongoing story of our collective memory, about how we can aspire to become a part of it, but also how, when we do find ourselves included, the part we're given might not be the one we envisioned, nor the one that is genuinely fulfilling. For in the end, the story of our life is not our own, and we don't get to write our own eulogy. Arrival, directed by Denis Villeneuve. If you could see your whole life from start to finish, would you change anything? This, it seems, is the central question of Arrival. But like Denis Villeneuve's premise in this alien invasion story, it is a deceptive one. We open on memories, from the beauty of love to the tragedy of loss. The story of a grieving mother unfolds. A linguistic expert named Louise.
I'm Colonel G.T. Weber.
One fateful morning she is called upon by the highest authorities, for they have arrived, and they come bearing a message. Villeneuve crafts an immaculate sense of mystery and tension through a purposeful command over pacing, imagery, and sound. Slow and foreboding, but always in motion, always in focus. Who needs wide coverage of a global event when you can convey its significance up close and intimate? You don't have to show what can be imagined. After all, the imagination always exceeds the frame. And being made from the language of dreams, it reaches right down into the very core. Together with Ian and a wide variety of scientists spread around the globe, the translation game begins. Who are they? What is their purpose? Language itself becomes the conflict. Exposition becomes storytelling. This, to me, is science fiction at its strongest. An intellectual problem to solve, a curiosity. One whose answer will reveal something fundamental about ourselves. Again, Villeneuve understands the heart of Ted Chiang's original story, doesn't water down its prolonged discussions and academic deconstructions, doesn't replace its essential fascination with mindless alien action. We all long to better understand ourselves, both as individuals and as a species. The way we come into existence, only to be forcefully pushed through it by the unrelentingly linear arrow of time, all the while being fully aware of what's happening. It is, as Louise puts it, a strange thing, and not as straightforward as it appears. As the true purpose of the alien's presence slowly reveals itself, so too does Louise her perception of time begin to unravel. Past, present, and future no longer seem as rigid as they once did. It is at this point that our understanding of the story also starts to change, invoking questions of determinism and agency. If we could see the whole of our lives, would we change anything? The thought is an exciting one, a liberating one, and yet, for Louise, the freedom we can only dream of changes very little, at least in absolute terms. And this is because the real question was never a speculative one. It was one about here and now. We don't need to see our whole life from start to finish, because we already know it. We already know that someday we are going to die, and that along the way there will be suffering and pain. But even though this knowledge might cause us to consciously or unconsciously shrink away from life, the real challenge, as Arrival so beautifully argues, is to overcome that fear and embrace life for what it is. For only then can we truly open ourselves up for what it also has to offer: beauty, love, happiness, and meaningfulness. That's how, despite knowing the journey and where it leads, we can, as Louise concludes, welcome every moment of it. I've always been fascinated by that inner drive that seems to exist within us, that essence that makes us ambitious, passionate, that pushes us to achieve things, to create things, to express ourselves in ways that go beyond mere survival, and sometimes even at the risk of it. It feels like a distinctively human desire, that longing to pour our heart and soul into something outside of ourselves, to let it envelop us, consume us. Andrei Rublev, directed by Andrei Tarkovsky. Before he told his own story in The Mirror, Tarkovsky detailed the life of the renowned Russian painter Andrei Rublev, a 3-hour epic that has both nothing and everything to do with the act of creation, eschewing a traditional narrative in favor of a series of loosely connected passages. We follow Rublev mostly as an observer to the lives of others while he himself struggles with what appears to be a crisis of faith. A crisis which is directly impacting his ability to paint. The prologue sets the stage of a humanity in search of transcendence, yet bound to earthly limitations. From here, things only get more complicated as Rublev experiences the consequences of oppressive regimes on artistic expression, the cultural tension between spiritual aspirations and bodily desires, and the general brutality and infliction of suffering that humanity is capable of, combined with the timeless questions, the impossible questions, on the moral responsibility of the artist, the connection between suffering, sacrifice, and redemption, and the real nature of God and humanity, infusing Rublev with doubt and growing despair. The disillusioned painter ultimately disconnects himself from his calling entirely and regresses into silence for many years until he witnesses a young bellmaker whose perseverance in spite of fear and uncertainty reinvigorates his spirit. "Let's go together, you and I," he says to the exhausted young man who broke down after completing his work. "You'll cast bells, and I'll paint icons." The revelation leads into one of cinema's most impactful transitions into color. All of history, all past suffering, all the fear and doubt overpowered by the brushstrokes of human passion. It's the everlasting power of art, transcending the ages to reach us in the here and now, an act that, in itself, already reveals something vital about the depths of our being. It's hard, though, to articulate exactly where Andrei Rublev derives its transformative power from, for it's not just an intellectual understanding, but a poetic one that Tarkovsky so eloquently captures here. His vision of medieval Russia is at once grand and intimate, featuring a variety of set pieces that rival those of David Lean, providing weight to the sheer size of history, and emphasizing the smallness of any particular human being living within it. Yet they are contrasted with prolonged quietude, with these tiny moments that add real texture and grit, and which instill that ineffable feeling that all is somehow connected, even if we, like Rublev, can't seem to make sense of it. And this, perhaps, is the real source of the movie's lasting beauty and relevance. The way it's structured, not so much as a logical strain of arguments building on each other towards an eventual conclusion, nor as a narrative cycling through that all-familiar dramatic structure, but rather as an almost biblical text made up of individual stories and parables, connected only by the stream of human consciousness and its eternally conflicting themes of passion and doubt, fear and courage, joy and suffering, and so on, that in the end come together in a beautiful mosaic, capable of inspiring a true epiphany. Amadeus, directed by Milos Forman. After a failed suicide attempt, an elderly man is committed to a hospital where he is visited by a priest. The man asks him if he knows who he is, to which the priest replies that it doesn't matter. All men are equal in God's eyes. Antonio Salieri looks up.
Are they?
The former composer shares some of his music, which were once, as he assures, very popular tunes. But the priest doesn't remember his work, and chances are, neither do you. And that's why this story is not named after Salieri, but after his contemporary, a composer who you have definitely heard of.
Wolfgang. Amadeus. Mozart.
With Amadeus, F. Murray Abraham commits to screen the role of a lifetime, a composer and fervent lover of music who just so happened to live in the time of Mozart. A joyous fate, one would say. And indeed, I can think of no better way to spark an interest for classical music than seeing Salieri gush over Mozart's compositions. The way he describes and relishes in the subtle progression of notes, the balance between instruments, the deep emotion at the heart of it, it's absolutely infectious, and makes you understand why he would describe it as hearing the very voice of God. There certainly is something unique to music, to this rather strange act of organizing sound, that makes it so timeless, so universal, and so immediately resonant, as if it indeed captures something higher than ourselves, something divine, which, if true, would imply this divinity also exists within us. Because even though Mozart wrote his music, as Salieri puts it, as if he were just taking dictation, in the end, it was still born out of his talent and skill, from within the limitations of human capacity. And this is where to live in Mozart's shadow also becomes a curse to Salieri.
All I ever wanted was to sing to God.
Being only a decent composer at best, to be confronted with true, history-altering genius instills within Salieri a deeply frustrating envy. One that escalates into obsession, a one-sided rivalry that eats away at him to the point where he declares himself to be an enemy of God, an enemy to that divine power which filled him with such passion, such longing, only to deny him the talent and virtually render him mute.
I will hinder and harm your creature on earth as far as I am able.
It's a fate that feels especially cruel given how Mozart, who is wonderfully portrayed here by Tom Hulce, appears to be such a boastful, lustful, smutty, infantile boy, as Salieri so lovingly describes him. Why would his divine incarnation be such a crude instrument, he wonders. Or better yet, why not let us share in the glory? Why fill us with an ambition we can never live up to, a yearning that never feels fulfilled, that will only leave us frustrated, envious, and cruel? Well, luckily, for all of us mediocrities, all of us mere mortals who can only look up at the light from a distance, who will live out our ordinary lives and disappear into anonymous history, we now have Salieri, our self-proclaimed patron saint, to absolve us of our sins. The Prestige, directed by Christopher Nolan.
Are you watching closely?
Opening with the now famous verbalization of the different stages of a magic trick, The Prestige immediately brings attention to its own narrative gambit, and by extension, Nolan's general philosophy of storytelling. It's an enticing one for sure, and like many of his later works, it fills The Prestige, a story about two magicians who slowly lose themselves in their increasingly violent aspiration to outperform each other, with mystery, suspense, and the excitement of revelation. But there is a lot more here too. The Prestige is not just about a rivalry, it's not about the secret to any of the tricks performed by the magicians. It's also about the meaning of wonder in a disenchanted world, and about the fate of authenticity in a modern society. For as is also often the case in a Nolan movie, the true revelation doesn't come from solving the puzzle of the central mystery. No, it comes from the impact on the characters and the world around them, and from unraveling the question of why the puzzle even existed at all. Set in the early 20th century, The Prestige captures a world that had already been reshaped by vast industrial progress, a grand metamorphosis that would mark the beginning of a new era, of the modern society as we know it today. A time defined by exponential technological growth, obviously, but as The Prestige shows us, it's also one of philosophical transformation. The magician Angier perhaps puts it best when he explains how the audience already knows the truth.
The world is simple. It's miserable. Solid all the way through.
Indeed, the modern world is a disenchanted one. A world that sacrificed its magic for scientific understanding, and that reduced its once inherent mystery to the not yet quantified. And as such, the appearance of the fantastical, by default, becomes an act of trickery, deception, a challenge to a man's intellect, albeit an enjoyable one, as they briefly remind us of a perceptual quality that has long since been lost, the capacity for true wonder. But, as the feuding magicians also make abundantly clear, these moments of transcendence also come at a cost. A disenchanted world eventually renders everything back to the ordinary, and needs ever more intricate illusions to recapture its lost wonder. Even here, however, there is an admirable quality in the dedication to the cause, and in the increasingly severe sacrifices that one is willing to make in order to achieve it. But a paradox also arises as the commitment goes too far, and ends up desecrating the very boundaries that once allowed the magical to exist in the first place, the sacred demarcations drawn around the moral, the humane, and ultimately the very notion of individuality and authenticity, all become essentially meaningless, instrumental in the pursuit of newer and greater wonders. This is the revelation. This is the Prestige, that while all the spellbinding magic keeps us transfixed on the grand stage, there is an inevitable human cost hidden behind the curtain that we fail to consider, because in the end, as Nolan presses towards us in the audience, we don't really want to know. We want to be fooled. Synecdoche, New York, directed by Charlie Kaufman. An iconic expression of absurdist filmmaking. Days pass within the language of a single scene. A painter's fame grows bigger as her paintings become tinier, and the woman buys a burning house that won't kill her until decades later. It captures the fundamental strangeness of the human experience, the absurdity that, as philosopher Albert Camus expressed, lies hidden just beneath the surface of our everyday lives, and that occasionally creeps along the edges of our awareness to remind us, if only for a brief moment, of the void at the heart of existence, the impenetrableness of its density, and the impermanence of its being.
And that's what I want to explore.
It's from this experience, this momentary revelation, that Cadence Play is born. A play that seeks to uncover the brutal truth, the essence of our humanity. a play to capture the meaning of everything. The futility of his dream is clear from the start, and becomes undeniable as the decades pass and the stage comes to encapsulate an entire city.
When are we going to get an audience in here? It's been 17 years.
And yet, his struggle is a deeply revealing one, for it's through his effort that Synecdoche, New York, gives texture to that confrontation between the human need for understanding and the unreasonable silence of the world. It shows human ambition, human passion as the unconscious flight from death, the reflexive revolt against cosmic indifference, and sheds light on the paradox of how we, like Caleb, can be both aware of our absurd fate, yet still cling to the hope of achieving some form of absolution from it. A dangerous hope, for it is also exactly because of Caleb's quest for ultimate truth that life completely passes him by, and that he becomes blinded by a self-centeredness that is only rarely breached by brief moments of genuine understanding, but which nevertheless leave him desperate and alone in the end. For ultimately, as the movie affirms, Caden is not special. Like everyone else, he struggled into existence and will now silently slip out of it.
This is everyone's experience, every single one.
Like Camus' philosophy, which was in search of a hope without appeal, a meaning to life without the need for a leap of faith, Kaufman too doesn't seem to want to rely on a resolution from beyond the horizon. Instead, through his magnum opus, he gives shape to the void, humanizes our absurdist condition, and in doing so, reclaims it for ourselves. Because without the hope of heavens and hells, of ultimate meanings or cosmic destinies, fate becomes a human matter, and meaning an act of revolt, an expression of an inner freedom that, as we'll discover, remains ours to command even as the ultimate play remains unfinished. And it's that inner freedom that enables us to contemplate our lives and our coming death and conclude that all is well. Or not. For, as Camus emphasized, one always finds one's burden again. But the point is, if we let it, if we choose so, the struggle in itself is already enough to fill our hearts. First Man, directed by Damien Chazelle. In 2014, Damien Chazelle burst onto the scene with the almost instant classic Whiplash, the story of the violent clash between a young drummer's ambition and the transgressive methods of his ruthless teacher. The resulting question of what we are willing to sacrifice for our passion is one that would become a recurring theme throughout Chazelle's work, and which, in my personal opinion, reaches its most poignant articulation in First Man, the true story of astronaut Neil Armstrong and of the groundbreaking space mission to put a man on the moon. Because I think it is here, contextualized in this grand historic setting, that Chazelle is able to beautifully capture the human spirit not just as an individual trait, but also as a collective one that, in part at least, defines us as a species, even though it is still not fully understood. For, as the movie lays out, there is a deeply contentious nature to human ambition, a conflict between reason and emotion, between the voice that makes us question whether the effort is worth the cost.
You don't have anything under control.
And that almost instinctual drive that pushes us forward regardless of the answer. It's one thing to explore this on an individual level, but when an entire nation has dedicated itself to a highly expensive and risky endeavor, the contradiction becomes all the more apparent. Why indeed spend all this money on some intangible achievement when you could be feeding the hungry? Why put human lives in harm's way when you could be helping the poor? They are, without a doubt, valid questions to ask as an individual and especially as a nation. And yet, clearly, as Chazelle also conveys through immaculate photography and the incredible score by Justin Hurwitz, there is something of intrinsic value here that goes beyond what can be captured in a cost-benefit analysis. and which is also heightened by looking at it on that collective level. It's the beauty of witnessing a heroic effort of human beings dedicating themselves towards a single purpose, and pushing the boundaries of what we are capable of as a species. As for what this really achieves, well, that's where we get to what I think was the real act of genius. The thing that made First Man struck a chord with me unlike any other work in Chazelle's filmography. And that's the way he connected a nationwide effort with the intimate journey of a parent struggling with the loss of his child. For like our human ambition, grief too has a certain irrational quality. Grief too is primarily driven by emotion, and yet it's one that we generally seem to be more understanding and accepting of. And I think that's because we recognize grief as being non-transactional, as being a process that we have to work through not to achieve something at the end, but rather to liberate ourselves from it, or at least to find a healthy way of coexisting with it. And maybe, as First Man seems to say, it works similarly for our human spirit too. Maybe our passion, our ambitions and obsessions are not so much about attaining something as much as they are about letting go. In this sense, it's not a matter of material gain, but of perspective. Or as Neil himself put it,
I think it'll be more the fact that it allows us to see things that maybe we should have seen a long time ago, but just haven't been able to until now.
We often associate love with romantic love, but it's about so much more than that. To love is to acknowledge and nurture any relationship, reaching out into the world and finding connection in nature and family and friendship, and yes, in romance. But to love is also to cultivate its source on the inside, from that inner place in our heart from which love can flow outwards, and the love around us can be received.
Dersu Uzala, directed by Akira Kurosawa. If I had to pick one classic film for a full-on 4K restoration, it would probably be Akira Kurosawa's Dersu Uzala. Unfortunately, the grand adventure through the Siberian wilderness, a unique collaboration between the Soviet Union and the Japanese master, remains limited to an at best serviceable print, leaving us to imagine the true glory of the stunning landscapes Kurosawa was able to put to film here. Nevertheless, Dersu Uzala still is a phenomenal work of rapturous beauty, recounting the real-life journal of a Russian explorer who undertook several expeditions into the then uncharted Siberia. We get to witness the edge of the world through several seasons, from the blossoming spring to the harsh winter cold. Kurosawa, as always, captures the elements with an immaculate sense of texture that instantly transports you to that different time and different place, and infuses the journey with poetic writings that provoke reflection on nature not so much as the indifferent realm which lies outside of humanity's domain, but more so as the living womb that envelops it.
Слишком мал человек перед лицом великой природы.
But more than being merely a man versus wild story, Dersu Uzala is a tale about friendship and connection. For on one of his expeditions, the Russian explorer meets the titular character Dersu, a seasoned local hunter. Though initially serving mostly as a guide to their party, offering local wisdoms and techniques for surviving the wilderness, it quickly becomes apparent that a real bond is developing. And not before long, a lifelong friendship is born. The transformative power of human connection immediately changes the atmosphere, filling the cold tundra with warmth and changing the whole of nature from an opposing force to an extension of man's communion. Venturing into the woods with Dersu is an absolute joy. Not because, as these stories so often risk, the indigenous character is a mere stand-in for the modern man's lost connection to the earth, but rather because there is a genuine goodness within him you can't help but want to be around.
and a thought-provoking way of life that you can't help but absorb. Having said that, as much as Dersu stands on his own, what he indirectly confronts us with cannot be denied either. The movie opens with the explorer in his later years, coming back to the frontier where his old friend lies buried, only to find a village has been built on top of it. The modern world is expanding. A new way of life is replacing the old one. It's the inescapable context of this archetypal tale, the grandiose domestication of the untamed, and the wisdom that is carelessly squandered in the process. And yet, in some strange way, that note of melancholy, as Kurosawa so delicately suggests here, has always been there as part of the world's greater symphony. Ebb and flow, day and night, life and death. It's the natural cycle that only becomes truly tragic once we remove ourselves from it completely, when we come to exist in a disconnected stasis, slowly forgetting that once we too were a part of this world, that once we too felt grounded within it, and intrinsically connected to the other beings that inhabit it. Children of Heaven, directed by Majid Majidi. Sometimes it takes the simplest story to invoke profound depth and poetic beauty. A young boy named Ali accidentally loses the shoes of his sister Zara. Stricken with guilt and with the fear of what this will mean for his family, which has been struggling financially, he confesses his mistake to Zara, and together they come up with a plan. Seeing as they don't go to school at the same time, Zara will wear Ali's sneakers in the morning and then give them back to him as he goes to school in the afternoon. It's from this basic premise that a series of obstacles follow for the two siblings. Zara is ashamed to wear her brother's oversized sneakers and tries to hide them from the other kids, while Ali, who now has to wait for Zara to come home, fears repercussions for being late at school. To us, of course, these troubles would be completely trivial, but what Majidi so beautifully captures here is how from a child's point of view, they mean everything. And it's exactly by so truthfully and empathetically preserving their perspective that we are not only reminded of the gravitas of our own childhoods, but also of the spiritual depths of the inner life of children in general. Indeed, as we are shown throughout the movie, from a young age, children already understand much about the world and experience a deep emotional richness. The guilt that Ali feels is as tangible and complex as that of any adult, and his efforts to make amends to his sister, such as giving her a pen which he got for doing well on the school test, demonstrate a profound compassion. Zara as well tries her best to keep Ali out of trouble, proving again and again that she cares as much about him as he does about her. There is a pureness here, an innocence that is deeply moving, and in some ways even aspirational. There is a beautiful scene where Ali and his father go uptown to find gardening work. The poor man, however, is so intimidated by the higher social status of his potential employers that he fails to get a foot in the door. But Ali holds no such reservations. When he befriends another boy, he sees, above all, just another child. The connection he makes not only helps his father get a job, it's also a reminder of something that for many of us was once the easiest thing in the world, but that for some reason seems so much more difficult now. It makes you wonder at what point we lost such a great quality. On the other hand, however, there's still a vulnerability here too, and as we also see on a few occasions, children still rely heavily on the presence of caring adults. In fact, it is precisely because Majidi captures so well the qualities and struggles present in every child, their intuitive awareness and sensitivity to serious issues like poverty and illness, their great capacity for joy, love and compassion, and above all, their inherent humanity and dignity, that we also come to understand the great importance that we can have in their lives. For even if it doesn't seem obvious to us, as Children of Heaven so definitively communicates, in the world of a child, even the simplest act of kindness can make all the difference. Good Will Hunting,
directed by Gus Van Sant.
You know what occurred to me? No. You're just a kid. You don't have the faintest idea what you're talking about. Why, thank you.
It's been about 15 years since I first saw Good Will Hunting. 15 years since this scene in which an empathetic psychologist effectively disarms a young man's veneer of superior intelligence by emphasizing the importance of actual lived experience hit me like a bombshell. And to this day it still very much captures the essence of this quietly powerful movie for me. For while it's ostensibly a very well-written and often entertaining story about a hyper-intelligent young man struggling with his past trauma, his attachment and abandonment issues, and all that other stuff that's probably neatly laid out in his file, I think that when you strip it down to its essence, Good Will Hunting is an appeal to not shrink away from life, to not hold yourself back, and to instead go out into the world, experience it, get hurt by it. It's a message that, strangely enough, feels even more relevant now than it did when the movie released, which might be why I'm still so drawn towards it. Because looking back now, after the internet and the digital world has changed everything, there is a certain quaintness about Will's life in the late 90s that makes the movie feel even more painful. Without making light of the specifics of Will's situation, to see him going to work with his best buddy, hanging out at bars, going to ball games, goofing around, I just can't help but slightly romanticize the way he is undeniably existing out there, in the physical world. Because like so many others that grew up with the internet, I spent too much of my youth in front of a screen, not necessarily alone, but still isolated. Having everything within reach, yet still experiencing it all indirectly. A life lived vicariously through intermediaries. Not all of this was bad, of course, but it's a balancing act, and it took me many years to realize just how much the balance was off, and that no matter how informative or constructive the vicariously experienced life can be, it can never fully replace the directly experienced one. Even now, I carry this movie with me almost like a mantra, a reminder that as much as I enjoy reading books and watching movies, and as much as I, also like so many others, am more or less forced to be in front of a screen in order to participate in this new society, the real essence of life is still out there in the world, and in the attachments we form within it. That, as I see it, is what the movie is getting at when it talks about what it really means to experience life, to experience love and pain, and to gain true wisdom and knowledge. And perhaps above all, Good Will Hunting demonstrates how easily we can miss out on all of this, how easily we can fool ourselves that we have seen it all, that we know it all. We can spend a lifetime living in that pretense, never truly knowing the world, and never truly knowing ourselves. For that's ultimately the real reason to care about all this, right? It's not about collecting random bits of experiential trivia about places and things that you can't read about online or in books. It's about deepening your inner being. It's about forming your character, getting to know yourself. It's about becoming a person. Before Sunset, directed by Richard Linklater.
I'm Celine.
Over the course of 18 years, Richard Linklater has created a trilogy quite unlike any other, though only giving us brief glimpses into the lives of Jesse and Celine, their first meeting, their brief reunion, and the day in their eventual marriage. The accumulated impact of these reaches far beyond the sum of its parts. It's a beautiful portrait of a relationship evolving over the decades, starting out young and somewhat naive, moving past that first disillusionment to reconcile what you thought life would be like with what it actually is. And then trying to reverse all that in a way, trying to rediscover and reconnect to that initial spark in the everyday trenches of adult existence. But while this is a fascinating and valuable deconstruction in its own right, the Before trilogy is also so much more. It's the story of love as the prime directional force of our lives. As that what we dream of, what we choose for, and what we work hard for to keep alive.
I guess when you're young, just believe there'll be many people with whom you connect with. And later in life, you realize it only happens a few times.
Yeah, you can screw it up, misconnect.
As the great Fred Rogers once said, Love is at the root of everything. All learning, all parenting, all relationships. Love or the lack of it. Indeed, while their dreamlike romance in Before Sunrise could have been just that, a first love at that time when you were still young enough to experience it purely, unencumbered by the reality and complexity of adulthood. A coming-of-age moment that is bound to fade away as the years go by. As we meet Jesse and Celine again in Before Sunset, it also becomes clear, in a both beautiful and tragic way, that the love they experienced together wasn't all youthful illusion. That while maybe still being somewhat rudimentary, inexperienced and untested by time, there was a tangible force at its center that is not to be dismissed, but rather to be nourished as we grow older. For as we see in Before Sunset, the absence of it has severely impacted both Jesse and Celine, and not for the better.
We're just living in the pretense of a marriage, responsibility, all these just ideas of how people are supposed to live.
It's the challenge of any young adult, I guess, to struggle with that conception of love as we first got to know it, and how it exists in our lives in the present. Obviously, it would be naive to think that it would always be as it was. But then again, how much of the dream do we sacrifice? How far do we compromise? And how do we know that what we have left is still enough? If anything, the great and liberating joy of this phase of the story is that no matter how we might answer these questions, what Jesse and Celine prove here is that it's never too late to turn things around if we want to, if we have to. It demonstrates that love isn't necessarily subjected to entropy, but that it can actually grow stronger, deeper, and connect us closer to ourselves and to those who we choose to spend our lives with. This is not to say our lives necessarily become easier, as Before Midnight so poignantly shows us in its final chapter. In fact, choosing love might actually demand us to be more conscious, more hardworking, and it might wreak more havoc on our hearts than a life without it. But I guess that's the point, isn't it? That if love is at the root of everything, there is no real life without it. Portrait of a Lady on Fire, directed by Celine Sciamma. Released in 2019, Portrait of a Lady on Fire carries the special credit of being the newest movie on this list. I try to keep in check as much as possible any recency bias, but this movie has just haunted me so thoroughly that I simply couldn't deny it any longer. A young painter is commissioned to make a wedding portrait of the reluctant bride-to-be without her knowing. But as they orbit each other in mutual observation, a spark ignites and grabs hold of the two women in that all-consuming and quietly terrifying way that only love can do. Suddenly, nothing else matters anymore. There's only the tension and the anticipation, a world reduced to stolen glances and careful gestures of growing affection. Every inch forward is of cosmic significance, slowly opening yourself up until the threshold is finally passed, at which point the built-up longing comes pouring out in such ecstasy that you wonder why you ever hesitated at all. The brief but intense romance beautifully demonstrates that to love is to expose yourself, it is to take a leap, and that's exactly what makes it so significant, so important. For as philosopher Alan Watts also observed, what love does is it creates virtue out of vulnerability and transforms our greatest weakness into our greatest strength.
But this is the most powerful thing that can be done. Surrender. See? And love is an act of surrender to another person. Total abandonment. I give myself to you. Take me. Do anything you like with me.
The revelation is not just transformative for the relationship between the two characters, but also for our understanding of love in general, of that strange power that feels like it can reshape the entire structure of our soul, not just fulfilling a longing, but deepening it, leaving you at once satiated to the core with pure beauty and life, and hungry for more, desperate for more. We reach out to each other as if we're touching infinity, and it obliterates us, leaving us forever changed. In trying to articulate this intangible impact that other human beings have on us, it was philosopher Emmanuel Levinas who perhaps put it best when he wrote, The relationship with another puts me into question, empties me of myself and does not let off emptying me. The desirable does not fill up my desire but hollows it out, nourishing me, as it were, with new hungers. It is love as the ultimate humanizing force, and as an act of creation too. Sciamma beautifully subverts the traditional setup between painter and subject in which one is the muse to the other, to instead depict an equalized playing field, the portrait containing not just that which is given by the subject, but also that which is given by the painter, a mutual surrender, an ideal that Sciamma extends to her setting at large. For out there the world is one of inequality, of hierarchies that will probably end up defining the actual circumstances of our lives. But in here, love is a safe haven. Everyone is treated with the same amount of respect and dignity. In here is the world that we truly inhabit, and that we carry with us in our hearts wherever we go.
There are some movies that directly engage our empathy, that ask us not to look at ourselves, but specifically towards others, especially those who are all too often ignored or neglected, and to really consider their feelings, their complexity, the fullness of their inner being, to look at them as human beings. They are the movies that remind us of the humanity that is present everywhere and within everyone.
Tokyo Story, directed by Yasuhiro Ozu. When a child is born, it quickly develops an almost natural egocentrism. After all, when reality is filtered through the singular point of your consciousness, and when you're always taken care of by others, it's hard not to feel like the world quite literally revolves around you. Fortunately, as we mature, we develop empathy, compassion, and we grow out of the childlike conception that we exist at the center of the universe. But never fully, and some less so than others. Within the structure of a family, there is an inevitable friction that arises here as the different generational layers move along the cycle of life, and their interactions gradually transform over time, which Ozu beautifully captures here with an almost meditative stillness and a tragic poignancy. In Tokyo Story, we follow an elderly couple traveling from the countryside to the city to visit their children, only to find they have little time for them. The only person who does seem to make an active effort is their daughter-in-law, whose husband, the son of the visiting parents, was killed years earlier in the war. What makes Tokyo Story so particularly painful is that while the movie locks you into the perspective of the elders and makes you sympathize with them, you will also no doubt recognize yourself in their children and all the ways in which you, in varying degrees, began to neglect your former caregivers as you became occupied by other burdens and responsibilities. It is true, as the movie also observes, that we outgrow our parents to some extent as we become independent and cultivate a life of our own, and vice versa, that our parents distance themselves from us as the gap between their image of who we were and who we have actually become widens to mixed emotional results. And yet, as Ozu also so clearly asks of us, does it really have to be this way? Or is this just a world as we have created it? For while it might be easy to point the finger at the selfish children who no longer have the time to attend to their parents, there's also a broader societal context here that feeds into what otherwise could be judged as a mere flaw of character. Because in a modern world that is progressing fast, and that is becoming increasingly busy, efficient, and transactional, what place do we really cultivate for our elders? What really is the point, as the youngest daughter wonders, of a family if children simply end up drifting away from their parents and leaving them behind? Is this what the cycle of life looks like? You raise someone until you become a burden to them? Or again, is this just a world as we have created it? And if so, is it possible to change it? This, it seems, is the final question that Ozu presses on us, not directly in a didactic sense, but implicitly through an immaculate synthesis of humanity and emotion that will for sure trigger your empathy and make you reconsider all the family ties you have been taking for granted. Land of Silence and Darkness, directed by Werner Herzog. When you let go of my hand, it is as if we were 1,000 miles apart. In one of his earliest documentaries, Herzog introduces us to Fini Straubinger, a woman who became both deaf and blind after an accident when she was a teenager. Watching her recount her story of being bedridden in utter isolation for 30 years, it doesn't take long to viscerally feel the heartbreaking tragedy of her fate. Losing your ability to communicate like that, losing your connection to the world like that. And yet, Fini Straubinger's story is only the beginning, for as a woman who has also dedicated her life to travel across Germany to meet with and help those who share her fate, she also becomes our guide into the broader world which is at one point referred to as the Land of Silence and Darkness. It's a land of unfathomable loneliness, and each person we meet seems to exist in an even more dire situation than the one before. A woman in her 40s lost the one partner who could communicate with her, and now sits silently and alone in an institution for the mentally ill. 2 children who have been deaf and blind since birth never knew the world at all, not in the way we do at least. Through a slow and arduous process, the most basic messages can be sent back and forth. But beyond that, their inner being, their understandings of more abstract concepts like hope or happiness, as one of the teachers remarks, remain a mystery to us. It leads us into what is perhaps the most tragic case, a young man in his early 20s, also deaf and blind from birth, yet one who never received such rudimentary education, and who will most likely never develop any way of communicating at all. The thought is almost horrifying, a human soul completely cut off from the world, drifting alone in the dark. And this, perhaps, is the documentary's greatest and most heartbreaking achievement, to quietly demonstrate, through the noble effort of Fini Straubinger, that we are still speaking of human souls here, that even though we cannot fully reach them, these people are as vividly alive as any one of us, living in darkness from the sun but shining like a star. One woman recites from a poem she had written about her condition. That is the art that only one whose soul is bent on heaven can understand. It must also be noted that, being such an early work of his, Herzog has not yet developed the trademarks he is now most well known for, and presents his story with remarkable simplicity. But it's also precisely in his asceticism that we find the key that in many ways unlocks the basic philosophy of his entire filmography. Because when stripped down to its essence, what Herzog does is to try and connect with his fellow human beings not just by getting a sense of the world as they experience it, but also of the world as they dream it. It's the effort to articulate the struggles and victories of the human soul, or, as he once referred to it, to uncover the inner chronicle of what we are. This is what seems to be his primary mission as a filmmaker, and which becomes all the more apparent here as he follows the tragic yet resilient Fini Straubinger, determined to bring out that spark of humanity, even from the deepest of darknesses. The Elephant Man, directed by David Lynch. A doctor in Victorian London comes across a circus featuring an attraction known as the Elephant Man. He gains a private audience, but just as the deformed creature is revealed to him, David Lynch only shows us the face of the doctor, overcome with compassion and with fascination. It immediately shifts the focus of the story, away from the spectacle and onto the beholder. It's not about what is seen, but about who is perceiving, and how this informs our interactions with each other. For there appears to be a strange paradox here. Humanity capable of great empathy, but not without active effort. Indeed, how fragile it can be, how easily it can be forgone when the face of the other, for whatever reason, lies outside of our empathy's natural reach. How easily we reduce them, rob them of their essence. Even the doctor, though establishing that piercing gaze that looks beyond the surface, only sees a medical marvel at first. Better than the circus boss for sure, but still an objectifying gaze.
I enjoy my visit here very much. It's so kind of you to have me in your own home.
It's only when we actually get to know John Merrick, when we get to experience his gentle nature, his gratefulness, and the strange love of life he appears to hold on to in spite of the great suffering and inhumanity he has had to endure, that a deep revelation comes into being that goes beyond the platonic message of looking for beauty beyond the surface. It's the Elephant Man not just as a tragic figure demanding our sympathy, though this will surely emerge as an almost inevitable side effect, but also as simply a man, a plain human being, no different from anyone else when it comes to his interiority. Again, it is not about what is seen, but about who is perceiving, and David Lynch thoughtfully treads the distinction, offering an effective critique of the way we can dehumanize others, especially those on the fringes of our society, without inadvertently indulging in that same spectacle that causes such dehumanization in the first place. When objectified, Lynch denies us to partake. When simply human, we see him as just that. And towards the end, when we understand the depths of his character, it is those around him who do not see him as such that become the monstrosities, and those that do, that become the true embodiments of what we generally call humanity. It is within this simple truth, it seems, that John Merrick too eventually finds his worth, transcending the identity that he accepted all those miserable years, the identity that others projected onto him, to instead become who he knows himself to be on the inside. A transformation that is affirmed loudly and clearly in that one moment that has been seared into my mind ever since I first saw it.
I am not an animal! I am a human being!
Bookended by two dreamlike visions of Merrick's inner world, detailing the beautiful ascension from fear into eternal life. The Elephant Man is but the beginning of what would become a much more abstract, and in some ways a more iconic filmography. Yet for me, it's this story that will always have a special place in my heart, not just as a phenomenal achievement in empathetic filmmaking, but also as a reminder of how empathy is something that must be actively and consciously practiced, and of how transformative and life-changing it can be when we do. Satantango, directed by Belatar. Set in a colorless, dilapidated Hungarian town that is slowly falling apart, a mysterious yet charismatic man who was presumed to be dead returns to the village with promises of a new beginning and of salvation. The residents, desperate for prosperity, for happiness, and a general sense of meaning, become enamored by what to them appears to be an almost messianic figure, and a long, long journey begins. When I first heard about Satantango about 10 years ago, it felt like the white whale of cinema. With a runtime of almost 7.5 hours, it is a movie that was just taunting you with its sheer size, though also one that you couldn't easily ignore either. For besides being deemed notoriously challenging, laborious, and painstakingly slow, it was also hailed as a masterpiece that, as a true cinephile, you had to have seen at least once in your life. Even now, I think that for many film fanatics, watching Satantango is like reading Infinite Jest. It's a rite of passage, one that gives you a sense of victory in the mere accomplishment of simply having made your way through it, regardless of whether you enjoyed it or even understood what was going on. So, what did I get out of it? Was it really worth the 7.5 hour runtime? Well, the thing is, as with the Turin Horse, Tar's movies do not only test your patience, but they also seem to deliberately undermine the most basic assumptions and expectations that most of us have internalized when it comes to comprehending stories. For there's something interesting that happens when you watch a movie this long and this slow. You disconnect yourself not just from your literal world as you take out pretty much an entire day to spend it in this story, but eventually you also begin to detach yourself from the framework through which you usually watch and comprehend movies. Because even if you're confused or even annoyed at first, even as you get bored or disinterested, as the hours go by and your brain becomes tired, at some point you just start to let go. You stop analyzing everything so much, stop thinking about everything so much, and you just become quietly entranced. Tar's immaculate ability to convey atmosphere is also an important factor here, unifying a myriad of different elements such as black and white photography, long takes and a variety of weather effects that all come together to become what feels like the very definition of bleakness itself. And yet it is within that almost viscerally experienced misery, in these bleak, hopeless environments that Tar forces us to inhabit, that we also come to understand the plight of the characters on a profoundly emotional level, come to see them as truly human, as beings who experience pain, loneliness, regret, who have an innate longing for love, for joy, and who, perhaps above all, desire to have a relief, even if only briefly, from the heaviness of existence, and from the suffering that is inflicted on them by an unforgiving world.
One thing is important, human dignity. And I just wanted to show you always, here is some poor, ugly, sad people. Maybe they are able to do crimes, but they are able to love each other, but they are human beings, and they have a right for the life.
Paterson, directed by Jim Jarmusch. Every morning, Paterson gets up, has breakfast, goes to work, writes some poetry, drives a bus, walks his girlfriend's dog, has one beer at a local bar, and goes to bed. We see him repeat this routine for an entire week, and by the end of it, nothing really significant seems to have happened. No great conflict, no grand resolution. Just an average week of what appears to be an average guy. It's incredibly tempting to look at Paterson and assume there must be some bigger, more dramatic narrative behind the facade. Maybe he's secretly miserable, maybe he feels trapped in his relationship, maybe he is even suffering from PTSD or something. And sure, all of this could be true, but what the movie seems to demonstrate, and which made it such a quietly impactful work to me, is that it may as well not be. Jarmusch is well known for breaking traditional narrative structures to focus more on the subtle, even poetic beauty of everyday life. And in doing so, he challenges one very basic idea that is subconsciously present in all of us and almost always reflected in the films we watch. The idea that the world around us is just a stage for our hero's journey, that we are the main characters in our respective stories. It's an understandable disposition. We do, after all, experience the world from the perspective and limitations of our own individual consciousness, but it's also one that profoundly affects the way we move through it, and not necessarily for the better. For how easily can we let the tiniest inconveniences become all-consuming grievances? How easily can we let ourselves get frustrated as if the entire world is plotting specifically against us? And in this regard, how easily can we look at Paterson and turn everything around him into a symptom of his inner state, thereby re-establishing him, and ourselves as the audience vicariously living through him, at the center of the universe. But, as also explained by David Foster Wallace, an author who feels especially relevant here, it doesn't have to be this way. We can choose to not fall into this default setting, choose to consider a world beyond ourselves, choose to adopt a less self-centered perspective, and in doing so, not only find renewed meaning, but also a new sense of appreciation.
But if you've really learned how to think, how to pay attention, then you will know you have other options. It will actually be within your power to experience a crowded, hot, slow, consumer hell-type situation as not only meaningful, but sacred, on fire with the same force that lit the stars.
In this sense, we can choose to see Paterson differently, choose to see an easygoing friend, a supporting partner, choose to see a man who is attentive, kind, and forgiving, who is interested in other people, sees beauty in the little things, and who is generally content and at peace. A man who is the absolute embodiment of conscious living, of those simple everyday virtues that we too can aspire to, that would dial back the grand drama and open up a new world of meaning, purpose, and fulfillment. This, to me at least, is what Paterson is about. This is the almost obnoxiously plain yet profound truth that it so beautifully encapsulates.
The really important kind of freedom involves attention and awareness and discipline and being able truly to care about other people and to sacrifice for them over and over in myriad petty little unsexy ways every day.
War and evil are, unfortunately, as intimate a part of humanity as love and passion are. And so I've always found it important to also seek out the great movies that explore and critically interrogate this violent and destructive side of ourselves, to understand on both an individual as well as on a collective level, its dynamics, its driving forces, and what hope there is to confront and overcome it.
Paths of Glory, directed by Stanley Kubrick. The First World War has always been an almost natural stage for anti-war storytelling. The sights of ruined wastelands, muddy trenches, and countless human lives being lost in an endless scrap over a few inches of territory. It all just screams meaninglessness. On this battlefield, men aren't heroically elevated. They are brutalized, misled by false promises of heroism. Their potential to actually partake in a greater purpose is wasted in the onslaught of violence, the all-devouring machine that demands not men, but bodies. Paths of Glory conveys all of this and more in a remarkably straightforward and unambiguous way. An uncaring general orders an impossible assault that unsurprisingly fails miserably. The blame, however, is placed on the soldiers, and it is decided that 3 of them are to be randomly selected for execution.
Therefore I humbly beg you, show mercy to these men.
Caught in the middle is our main point of view character, an officer played by Kirk Douglas. Being both on the ground with the soldiers expected to blindly follow orders and die for their countries, as well as in the fancy rooms with the higher-ups deciding their fates, a contrast arises that can only be described as infuriatingly absurd. The absurdity of war might just be the most effective approach to truly dismantle the deeper mechanics that drive men to war. For even more so than the destructiveness and violence, absurdity directly undermines meaning, which, if you follow some great thinkers like Ernest Becker, is the foundational cornerstone justifying warfare. Suffering can be forgiven, even death can be embraced, as long as the sacrifice is perceived to be serving a reasonable purpose. But 3 men randomly selected for execution after an already catastrophic battle that should never have happened in the first place clearly does not fall within that category. With this illusion shattered, the true nature of war reveals itself, and one of the greatest anti-war pictures comes into focus. Kubrick already paints a damning visual contrast between the soldiers existing in stark conditions and the superior officers relishing in lavish luxury. But the poison runs deeper than this, for the higher up we go, the more it becomes clear that war is a political and an egotistical game, not just between nations, but also between individuals. Scandals must be avoided, one's own rank and progress must be secured. War as a violent act of transference. Successes are claimed by the top, failures are cast down to the bottom. It is soldiers living and dying not in service of some great cause, but at the whims of cruel men and their petty concerns. Our officer desperately tries to mediate between the 2 layers, desperately tries to save his men from a meaningless death. But we quickly come to understand that his effort is not going to change anything. True virtue, it seems, cannot take root within this system.
I apologize, sir, for not telling you sooner that you're a degenerate, sadistic old man.
And you can go to hell before I apologize to you now or ever again.
Disillusioned and defeated, he carries on. But before Kubrick lets us go, he deals one more devastating blow with what to me still is one of the greatest endings to a war movie. A simple yet deeply resonating reminder of the innate dignity existing within all human beings, crying out to be safeguarded. Apocalypse Now, directed by Francis Ford Coppola. It's almost impossible to separate the cinematic experience of Apocalypse Now from the Herculean effort of its production. Even if you don't know anything about the heart of darkness that Coppola and his crew ventured into to create this, you almost certainly still feel it through the screen. Indeed, if there's one movie with a convincing argument for the power of doing it for real, it's this one. The Ride of the Valkyries in particular remains one of the most staggering sequences ever made, with the fleet of helicopters, series of explosions, numerous extras, and of course, the music by Wagner, all coming together to overwhelm you with the absurd chaos of warfare. There's just nothing quite like it, which rings true for the movie in its entirety. From the opening scene, Coppola makes clear that he's not just bringing us into a war, but rather into the subjective experience of one. War as it ravages the human mind and human soul, turning our lived reality, and in some ways the essence of our being, into what feels more like a fever dream bound to drag us deeper into its nightmarish depths. At the heart of it, there is Kurt, the personification of madness itself, the man who has already gone off that deep end, the man who Willard is sent in to terminate.
Terminate with extreme prejudice.
As Willard is released from his limbo and sets out into the jungle, he brings us along the various sites and stages of the Vietnam War as if we're descending down into the circles of hell, with each of them stripping another piece of our humanity, with each of them coming a little bit closer to that face of horror, of absolute moral collapse. The Ride of the Valkyries, for example, which happens quite early on, captures the strange spectacle of war and the absurdity of its destruction, which is also emphasized through the iconic character Kilgore, who has become seemingly desensitized to the chaos around him, and just wants to catch some good waves with his surfer buddies. It's but one of many instances where, despite dealing with heavy subject matter, Coppola infuses the seriousness with a certain cinematic joy. I wouldn't quite call it humor, but there's just a certain energy to the whole thing that creates enough detachment to make Apocalypse Now an exhilarating ride. You know, to have that experience of capital C cinema, without undermining what it ultimately also wants to portray. That war is madness, that it's a force that erodes us down to our most primal, violent instincts, lashing out indiscriminately, unthinkingly, unmitigated by our better nature.
Because there's a conflict in every human heart between the rational and the irrational, between good and evil.
Are you an assassin?
Marlon Brando sells this unlike any other as Kurtz in that final sequence where, instead of going for a big climax, which you often see in movies like this, and which Coppola's production team initially envisioned before realizing they would never be able to top the Valkyrie scene, they ended up scaling down to really focus on that more intimate confrontation between Willer and Kurtz. It was, without a doubt, the best decision, resulting in a finale that perfectly captures the accumulated insanity of everything that had come before, and that firmly established Apocalypse Now as one of the greatest cinematic masterpieces ever made. Come and See, directed by Alan Klimov. If war had a face, it would be this one. By now, the image of the young Belarusian soldier, ravaged by violence and atrocities during the Second World War, has become an iconic landmark in cinema. Rarely has the corrupted transformation from innocence and heroic aspiration into utter desperation and ruin been so effectively captured, as if every atrocity ever committed, every pain that has ever been suffered, every experienced moment of fear and terror, have all been filtered through the soul of this one person, and hollowed it out in the process. It's a powerful visual statement for sure, But the real effectiveness of the horror, I think, stems not so much from the act of observation, from us merely witnessing the harrowing journey of this young boy from the outside in, but rather comes from us experiencing it from the inside out. It is strange to describe a war film as beautiful, especially one like Come and See that doesn't shy away from depicting atrocity after atrocity. But there's just an otherworldly quality to the way Klimov draws us into this story, with its long lingering takes and floaty camera work, that I've always found weirdly hypnotic, as if you're venturing into a dream that soon turns into a nightmare you can't wake up from. The experience comes mainly from the movie's impressionistic approach that filters reality through a subjective lens. In other words, the soundscape we hear is not so much the one produced by the world, but more so by the mind of the young soldier, heightening some noises while dampening others, and sometimes even imagining sounds that aren't there at all, especially during the most terrifying moments, where the horror becomes just too overwhelming and the mind is overrun with chaos. The visuals too are often similarly distorted by subjective interpretation and imagination, resulting in unsettling POV shots, exaggerated focus points, and deliberate breaks in continuity that have us continuously questioning whether or not the image we see is actually there, or if it's just constructed in the mind, which in turn is precisely what diffuses that boundary between object and subject, between the audience and the tortured soul they're inhabiting. It's a manipulation of the senses that reveals the true ravages of warfare, not just what it sounds like or looks like, but what it feels like, how it brutalizes our humanity, tears it apart from the inside out, ruining us to the point where the image of past goodness, of past wholeness, starts feeling absurd, accumulating in that unforgettable montage where we are sent back in time, reversing all the chaos and destruction that has been inflicted, all the chaos that has risen, back into a picture of innocence, staring at us with an alienating distance, and which at this point can only be responded to with a strange disbelief, as if it never existed at all, as if there never was anything but the faces we are now surrounded by. The many faces of perpetrators and victims, fully consumed by darkness, evil, by pain, sorrow, and despair. The many faces that leave us wondering, without real hope of answer, where do we go from here? Shoah, directed by Claude Lanzmann. There are some movies that you need to see at least once in your life, and once only. In this case, not just because of its almost 10-hour runtime, or because of the gravity of its subject matter, but also because one viewing is simply enough for it to convey everything that it needs to completely transplant something deeply important and deeply transformative from it to you. Shoah to me still stands as the ultimate embodiment of such an experience, an epic documentary recounting the story of the Holocaust, presented mainly through interviews with those who directly witnessed this great atrocity of the modern age, and long takes of B-roll footage of the historic sites as they stood at the time of filming. Famously, Lanzmann refused to include any archival footage, narration, music, or reenactments, and was firmly against the idea of conveying the Holocaust through staged narrative drama, believing that there are some things that just cannot and should not be represented. The statement was, and still is, somewhat controversial, and personally I don't think I fully agree with Lanzmann in his assumption that, as filmmaker Tim Blake Nelson also pointed out, that the Holocaust is somehow more sacred than all the other expressions of humanity's inner darkness and capacity for evil that have occurred throughout history, and that are still happening today. Yet, with regards to Shoah, the approach is undeniably effective and profoundly moving. There's a strange feeling of both familiarity and alienation that creeps up on you when seeing all these now empty sites where crimes against humanity once took place, just sitting there in silence and peace, the specter of their past slowly becoming a growingly distant echo. It reminded me of my own upbringing in a country still carrying the scars from the Second World War. Walking through forests that still harbored abandoned bunkers and fortifications, it was strange to imagine that I was standing in the exact place where human beings once suffered and died. Stories of the past often can't help but separate themselves from us, as if being stored in and recounted from a different, more mythological realm. And so, to stand among their actual ruins, or as in Shoah, to see them as they really are, can reground them, as it were, back into the everyday, suddenly rendering them uncomfortably close and tangible. But most of all, the real lasting impression that Shoah left on me came not from its haunting B-roll footage, but from its subjects, the direct witness accounts from those who lived through the Holocaust. An atrocity of this magnitude, just as any genocide or disaster really, is all too often reduced to the statistics, as if the gravity of the crime or catastrophe is best conveyed by the number of innocent victims it claimed, the quantitative amount of suffering that was endured. But in a sort of inverse of the popular saying, to save one life is to save the world entire, I've personally found that the real weight of a tragedy is best conveyed qualitatively. That is, through the genuine experience of another's humanity, even if it is just one human being reaching out and truly touching you. That for me was enough to understand how, in their suffering, a world in its entirety was lost. The Thin Red Line, directed by Terrence Malick. There is an idea that is suggested in this movie that I've always seen as the perfect encapsulation of Malick's cinematic sensibilities, which is that humanity has one big soul that everyone's a part of, that we're all just different faces of the same being. Whether he truly believes it or not, it certainly feels like that's the premise at the heart of his presentation.
Everyone looking for salvation by himself.
To watch a Terrence Malick movie is to inhabit the inner worlds of multiple characters as they pontificate on their lives and the meaning of their being. It is to float around creation, to leap across time, into memory and imagination, as if all is mysteriously entangled with each other. And it's this idea, this notion of the universe experiencing itself, that I think is also the key ingredient that makes The Thin Red Line work so well as an anti-war movie. Because if all is connected, if we really are one big soul, what this means is that when we're hurting each other, we're also hurting ourselves. Set in the Pacific theater of the Second World War, The Thin Red Line juxtaposes the violent clashes between the American and Japanese forces with the serene beauty of nature. We meet Private Witt here as he, with some fellow soldiers, has gone AWOL to hang out with a tribe of native people. It's a brief glimpse of paradise, human beings living in harmony with each other and being nurtured by the world around them. As the war eventually catches up with them, the conflict that follows has an almost unnatural feel to it, as if humanity is somehow diverging from its natural state. Though one can wonder, as Malick also does later on, if the distinction is really as simple as that. When we get deeper into the jungle, where we see different plants and trees vying with each other for light and nutrients, and where predators are always stalking for prey, it becomes evident that violence and cruelty are embedded within this place too, at least to some extent.
What's this war in the heart of nature?
It raises the conflict to a more existential level, surpassing the specific historical context to offer a deeper meditation on the metaphysics of war. This great evil, as one character asks, where does it come from? Is there an avenging power in nature? Not one power, but two. Why give us that glimpse of what we might have known, only to ruin it before our very eyes?
What difference you think you can make, one single man, in all this madness?
But as despairing as these musings might be, Malick also knows how to turn them around and refocus on that other force that is also there within nature and within us, and which might be the stronger one in the end. For love, as another character observes, cannot be extinguished by war, cannot be conquered. This, then, might be the real question, the real challenge. How do we stay connected to that power, to that beauty, that calm hidden beneath the raging surface? If we're all part of one big soul, can we find our way back to it, live inside of it again? The answer, to me at least, is best answered by the movie's most disillusioned character, a man firmly existing in the profane world who, towards the end, does connect to some deeper longing, some connection to a greater beauty, a greater peace that must be out there somewhere, even if he cannot immediately find it. If I never meet you in this life, he says, let me feel the lack, a glance from your eyes, and my life will be yours.
With the darker side of the human condition, there is inevitably the question of justice. Where do we draw the line between right and wrong? And how do we, as individuals and as a society, ensure the former succeeds over the latter? The question is as old as philosophy itself, and it is clear that we have found no definitive answers. Yet we can explore the complexities and get a better understanding of why and how the issue of justice is woven so deeply into the fabric of our being.
12 Angry Men, directed by Sidney Lumet. A premise brilliant in its simplicity. A young man is on trial for a seemingly clear-cut murder case. The 12 men of the jury convene, confident they'll reach a quick and unanimous verdict. One of them, however, isn't so sure, and it is his seed of doubt that will not only set in motion the main conflict of the movie as it causes the titular angry man to start hashing it out, but also that which slowly but surely transforms this otherwise straightforward courtroom drama into one of the finest cinematic examinations of justice, prejudice, and moral integrity ever made.
Then what do you want? I just want to talk.
Lumet clearly lays out the stakes as the lone dissenter, Juror 8, explains in no ambiguous terms that he is not arguing for the defendant's innocence, but that based on the provided evidence, he simply doesn't feel confident in determining guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, which, after all, is what the American justice system demands in these decisions. It brings attention to the institution in its entirety, and the clash between its aspirations towards objective, impersonal and well-reasoned judgments, and the reality of what happens when its execution is ultimately placed in the hands of people who are, well, not built for that, or at least not without seriously challenging the other aspects of their being. Our tendency towards groupthink is first on the chopping block as number 8 indirectly reveals how easily other jurors went along with the proposed guilty verdict simply because it was the safe majority opinion.
Oh, come on, nobody can know a thing like that. This isn't an exact science.
That's right, it isn't.
It's one of those things that has arguably only become more relevant in our current social landscape. The ease with which we surrender our own critical thinking and opinions just to fit in with our desired tribe. But as 12 Angry Men also so famously shows, the issue goes deeper than this. As individuals, our perception and reasoning is fundamentally clouded by emotions and prejudices, which in some of the jurors rise painfully to the surface as number 8's case for reasonable doubt grows stronger. Coming from a variety of different backgrounds, experiences and values, each of the jurors represent a different cross-section of society, and therefore bring different biases to the table that have them falsely believing, or rather, wanting to believe, in the guilt of the defendant, irrespective of the arguments supporting the contrary. As the debate heats up on this already hot day, Lumet beautifully makes the room the entire movie takes place in feel more claustrophobic, as if with each scene, the walls move in a little closer. His camera work has also been widely praised here as the slow transition from wide angles into tight close-ups still stands as one of the prime examples of commanding tone through cinematography. Indeed, everything about 12 Angry Men comes together for its pitch-perfect deconstruction of the American justice system, the people being subjected to its procedures, and those burdened with the task of judgment. A task which, as Lumet seems to want to convey, demands a greater responsibility than it initially seems, and might reveal more about ourselves than we were willing to face. Judgment at Nuremberg, directed by Stanley Kramer. The true account of the landmark trial held by the Allies against various representatives of Nazi Germany after the Second World War, in this case 4 German judges who once enforced Nazi laws, sentencing countless innocents to death and oppression.
The tribunal is now in session. God bless the United States and this honorable tribunal.
While presented in the trappings of a gripping courtroom drama, which it is, Judgment at Nuremberg is also a profound exploration of complicity, moral compromise, and the capacity for ordinary people to commit or condone unspeakable acts under the guise of a myriad of rationalizations and excuses. Not so much to condemn those on trial, as if the idea is to close a dark chapter of history and to let us exit the movie feeling righteous and morally elevated, but more so to really consider the crimes of these individuals as those that could have been committed by anyone, to really explore that banality of evil as it still exists today in our societies, our interrelationships, and in ourselves. Overseeing the trial is Judge Dan Haywood, an American jurist grappling with the weight of his task. His perspective and general worldview, grounded in a sense of ethical responsibility, is immediately contrasted with a much more complicated political landscape. The Nuremberg trials were controversial from the beginning for a variety of reasons. As Haywood also remarks at one point, all the most important leaders of the Nazi regime were already gone, killed themselves before they could be hanged.
Now we're down to the business of judging the doctors, businessmen, and judges. Some people think they shouldn't be judged at all.
Moreover, the United States, now slipping into the Cold War, finds itself reluctant to alienate West Germany and its people, a pragmatic consideration that complicates the mission of the tribunal. And it's this external pressure, coupled with the defendants' insistence that they were merely following their duty, merely carrying out the law, that forces Haywood, and by extension the audience, to confront those most painful questions. To what extent are individuals responsible for actions carried out under state orders? To what extent can we claim innocence within a violent regime, separate our conscience from the world that we are intrinsically a part of?
If we did know, what could we do?
These almost existential musings on responsibility and justice are given an extraordinary weight by being framed within a devastating context. For the trials at Nuremberg didn't merely serve to convict a few individuals, but also to collect and organize irrefutable evidence of all the crimes against humanity committed by the Nazis. It provides the setup for one of the most haunting sequences I've ever seen. A simple presentation, detailing in clear factual language, with actual historical footage, the reality of the concentration camps.
The map shows the number of and location of concentration camps under the Third Reich.
While sparking a natural outrage over those who actively participated in this genocidal effort, the more compelling accusation, to me at least, is the one that is leveled towards those who knew but did nothing. Those who allowed great atrocities to happen not through their actions, but through their silence. It is a sentiment that I think transcends the era in which the film is set, and that might even be more relevant than ever as a reminder of the need for moral courage, for eternal vigilance against corrupting forces, and for individuals to hold themselves to higher standards than those set by the world around them. Harakiri, directed by Masaki Kobayashi. Whenever virtues are codified into a creed, they also become externalized, the individual no longer just following his own moral compass, but also that of a collective, of an institution. An important act, generating brotherhood, purpose, and honor, and laying the foundations for mutually acknowledged norms and systems of justice. But as Kobayashi demonstrates here with his critique of the samurai culture, sometimes these institutions can take on a life of their own, becoming too rigid, too dogmatic, thereby slowly eroding the morality at their center and transforming into a shadow of their former selves, hypocritical, unjust, and cruel. At its core, Harakiri is a story of revenge, but not in the usual sense of violent vengeance or personal satisfaction. Instead, it is the revenge of truth against myth, and of human dignity against the rigid structures that deny it. Framed as a story within a story, we meet Hanshiro as an aging samurai who enters a clan's domain looking to perform seppuku, or harakiri, the ritual of death that allows a samurai to take his own life and die with honor. But before he does, he shares the story of another samurai who came before him, a samurai who came to the clan with a similar request only to be forced, in a cruel twist, to carry out the ritual using a dull bamboo blade, thereby turning the noble demonstration of bravery into a spectacle of humiliation inflicted on a desperate man. From this, a moral investigation unfolds that gradually lays bare the hollowness of the clan's supposed honor, with each new detail peeling back the layers of hypocrisy that underpin the clan's blind insistence on the samurai traditions, even as they violate the very virtues they claim to preserve. Kobayashi's presentation is absolutely immaculate here, with a beautiful usage of light and shadow, and a remarkable command over tone and setting, with the clan's stone courtyard in particular, standing as an increasingly claustrophobic metaphorical prison. He is also careful to present the clan not as evil, but more so as just hollow, clinging to outdated structures that clearly no longer serve their intended purpose, and transforming them from protectors of a moral code into authoritarians concerned only with their own power and reputation. This, then, is exactly the kind of system that Hanshiro seeks to defy, not just the one from the clan in front of him, one limited to a particular time and place. Rather, he challenges the very idea of any institution that places its own survival over the well-being of the individuals it claims to serve. It leaves us questioning how many similar codes persist in our society, how we too have submitted ourselves to institutions that demand our conformity and sacrifice, yet offer nothing in return but hollow ideals. And through the unforgettable conclusion of his rebellion, Hanshiro firmly reminds us that honor and justice, when divorced from humanity, become a weapon rather than a virtue, and that true honor is not something dictated by systems or codes, but by acts of humanity and empathy that truly value and serve individuals. Memories of Murder, directed by Bong Joon-ho. The good old murder mystery has always been a staple of cinema, yet it's a much more complicated genre than it may seem. Tapping into some of our most innate emotions and curiosities, the puzzle might draw us in with relative ease, but resolving that investment in a satisfying way, that's the deceptively tricky part. For how often does the resolution not quite live up to the built-up suspense? How often does a little disappointment emerge as we realize it was more exciting not to know? Memories of Murder understands these dynamics and plays them like a fiddle. Set in a small Korean province in the 80s, a series of brutal homicides have the local police force struggling for answers, and a big city detective is brought in to assist them. The cat and mouse game begins, but not necessarily in the way you might expect, for as the case drags on, more victims are claimed, and despair in the community grows. The story too slowly transforms into something deeper and darker, as our gaze shifts away from the murderer and towards those who are trying to catch him. The setting also plays an essential role in the story's disquieting atmosphere, with the ordinary landscape of the countryside enveloping the brutality of the murders as an indifferent witness. It is a strange juxtaposition between violence and normalcy that invokes questions about the nature of evil and whether it is a product of environment or simply an aberration that can emerge anywhere, even in the most unsuspecting places. Detective Park, the first one on the case, initially relies on crude and clumsy methods to physically intimidate his suspects and coerce confessions out of them, convinced he can bully his way to the truth. The arrival of the big city detective, then, brings a contrasting approach, representing the voice of reason with meticulous attention to evidence and procedures. But as he too fails to provide answers, the differences between the rural instincts and the urban methodology start to break down, revealing a deeper, more disturbing reality, that the crime itself may defy explanation, order, and understanding. The black hole that results from the seemingly unsolvable mystery starts eating away at everyone involved, turning them increasingly cruel to the point where the line between investigator and perpetrator starts to blur. Bong Joon-ho portrays this descent with a sense of tragic inevitability, suggesting that under pressure, even those who seek justice can become as monstrous as the evil they pursue. In one of the most haunting endings to any mystery thriller, it becomes painfully clear that Memories of Murder is not merely about solving a puzzle, but a profound exploration of the limitations of justice in a world where the truth is often out of reach. It confronts us with the terrifying notion that evil can persist, lurking just outside the edges of our understanding, resisting explanation or containment. It is a movie that leaves us not with a sense of closure, but with a lingering unease, reminding us that sometimes, despite our best efforts, there are questions that cannot be answered and horrors that cannot be rationalized. Memories of Murder doesn't simply end, it echoes, like an unsolved case or a memory that refuses to fade, reminding us of the unsettling truth that some darknesses are too deep to ever be fully known. No Country for Old Men, directed by the Coen brothers. This quietly subversive neo-western, for me, was one of those gateway movies that brought me into the higher realms of cinema. Here I was, a young teenager believing he was about to see an exciting action crime movie, featuring modern cowboys, old-timey sheriffs, cool bad guys, and of course, a big bag of money that ties them all together. What I actually got, however, puzzled me deeply. Did they really just kill off the main character like that? Where is the music? And what was up with that ending? I had no idea how to feel about it all. And yet, the movie lingered in my mind. There was just something about it, something elemental almost, that kept drawing me back, and that would go on to change my entire perception of what cinema can be. Not just plot and excitement, but atmosphere and poetry. Today, to watch No Country for Old Men is like watching a clashing of raw natural forces. Based on the book by Cormac McCarthy, who is well known for his bleak yet fascinating perspectives on violence and chaos. Here too we see a certain collapse of the order, a world that no longer holds the same certainties that it used to, though of course, one can wonder if it ever did to begin with. Either way, in this desolate landscape, human beings are seemingly reduced to mechanisms, operating as if purely driven by unreflective instincts. At the center of it, we find Anton Chigurh, who pretty much immediately became one of cinema's most iconic villains, a status that has only further cemented itself over time.
What's the most you ever lost on a coin toss?
But more than being the main antagonist, Chigurh also stands as the extreme embodiment of those forces of chaos that have been infecting the world at large. The evil he commits is dispassionate, detached, and often at the whim of chance, famously flipping a coin to decide whether his victims live or die.
Just got it.
And through his actions, he invokes that broader feeling that fate is arbitrary, that no one controls anything, and that death can befall anyone at any time. even those we perceive as the main characters. He stands in stark contrast with Sheriff Bell, who comes from a world, or rather a worldview, in which good and evil were more clearly defined, and in which there was a more general order to the world and to the extent that man could understand it.
The crime you see now, it's hard to even take its measure.
Being confronted with Ikiru, and with the case he can neither solve nor even comprehend, everything he once believed in, that fundamental sense of justice, of order, that he thought lay at the foundations of the earth, all come crumbling down in the face of a much darker reality. A reality that most likely had always been there hiding beneath the surface. It's a rather bleak perspective, but as with many of McCarthy's works, it's also where the story finds its philosophical power. For what it also shows is how, despite all this, humanity still finds itself resilient, defiant even, ready to meet those forces of chaos, no matter how the chips may fall.
A man would have to put his soul at hazard. He'd have to say, okay, I'll be part of this world.
Though human beings are endlessly fascinating in their own right, as a society, we become something else. There's a different dynamic, a different structure and behavior to humanity as a collective, which in turn also affects how we act on an individual level. These sociological issues, how a society functions and how it impacts the people living within it, can be highly intricate and complex, but they can nevertheless deliver meaningful and important insights.
Network, directed by Sidney Lumet. Surely one of the most prescient movies of the 20th century, not just with regards to the transformation of popular media, increasingly commercial, sensationalist, exploitative, but also when it comes to the profound effects this had on our collective and individual being. The old world is presented mostly through old faces. Howard Beale, a once popular news anchor, has been fired after years of declining views. His best friend and head of the news division, Max, also finds himself struggling to preserve old-school values in the face of the new, the face of Diana, a young executive hungry for better ratings and ad rates, and seemingly willing to cross any boundary to achieve them. Instead of being in direct conflict, however, with the new world simply overpowering the old, Network depicts a more complicated entanglement. After hearing a strange voice at night, Howard's farewell address turns into a sensational rant.
Well, I'm not going to leave you alone. I want you to get mad.
Max thinks he is having a breakdown. He probably is. But the almost messianic message led to massive ratings, which prompts Diana to bring him back as a form of counter-programming. In a world of quick consumerist entertainment, even the unvarnished truth, it seems, becomes just another dopamine hit. And despite Max's philosophical conflicts with Diana, he does become infatuated with her as a person, falling for the same exciting allure that has people turning into her television shows. And the two strike up a romantic affair. It doesn't take long, however, for reality to kick back in, and the real extent of the damage reveals itself. Sociologically speaking, we come to understand our passive submission to the tube, to that which presents itself to us as real life, but which really is mostly empty calories. For the moment, Howard goes beyond riling people up with mere sentiment to offer an actual critique of the system that threatens its bottom line. The system immediately snuffs out his fire in that iconic scene of corporate rage.
You have meddled with the primal forces of nature, Mr. Beale, and I won't have it!
And on that more intimate and personal level, we come to see just how much of our humanity we have sacrificed by dulling our senses and frying our attention span. In another wonderfully written scene, Max's wife, after finding out about his affair, asserts her violated dignity so fiercely that we are somehow awakened to the greater loss of emotional capacity, a loss that eventually overwhelms Max as well. And to me, this is really where we get at the heart of Network's clairvoyance, the essence of its central warning. It's that vision of human beings reducing each other to the metrics of entertainment, of transactions and distractions. A vision of a world in which sincerity and vulnerability have become like a foreign language, in which the inner complexities of our being are no longer cared for.
You're dealing with a man that has primal doubts, Diana.
Though unfortunately, as the movie seems to somewhat pessimistically put forward, it might be exactly at this point of the message that people will tune out in search of something more exciting. Koyaanisqatsi, directed by Godfrey Reggio. A drop of water behaves differently than a river, and a city is more than the sum of its inhabitants. If you zoom out enough, the world changes significantly. It becomes its own living organism, moving across space and time, evolving, transforming, over and over again. This is the perspective that Koyaanisqatsi offers. A look at our world and at ourselves from the outside, without narration, without explanation, just sound and imagery, and a phenomenal score by Philip Glass. In the beginning, as we see, there was only the land, with water cutting riverbeds into the earth, and clouds accumulating and dissipating in the sky. Then man entered the scene, and quickly became the dominant impacting force on the earth, reshaping its surface, displacing its stones, and taming the old powers that once moved freely. A grand metamorphosis, giving birth to cities, to new flows of matter and energy, and to a new awe-inspiring vision of what is yet to come, of what is possible, a vision of paradise. But alas, the reality of the vision seems to remain elusive. The dreams we build wither away in their manifestation. Once more then, away with the old, starting over from scratch. This time we'll get it right. The wheels of progress will carry us further, satisfy our every need and desire. Faster and faster. We'll get there, any moment now. At this point, the electricity is palpable, and Reggio amps up the sensation with breathtaking time lapses, and with the kinetic energy of his editing. And then he snaps us out of the dream to let us sit with the fallout, with the realization that despite our monumental achievements, despite our unprecedented progress, something is missing, something fundamental remains unfulfilled. All culminates with the launch of a spaceship, with mankind reaching for the stars, only to burn up in the atmosphere, and plunge back to the land from which it once arose in a painfully slow descent. To some, that last haunting vision may read as cynical, and while there clearly is a critical commentary here about modern society, I've always felt it also uncovers something deeper, something more poignant and poetic, about the nature of our humanity, and about the forces that drive and so often frustrate us as a species. And to articulate it, I'll leave you with a passage from the novel A Canticle for Leibowitz, which I think captures it best. The closer men came to perfecting themselves a paradise, the more impatient they became with it, and with themselves as well. They made a garden of pleasure, and became progressively more miserable with it as it grew in richness and power and beauty. For then, perhaps, it was easier to see something was missing in the garden, some tree or shrub that would not grow. When the world was in darkness and wretchedness, it could believe in perfection and yearn for it. But when the world became bright with reason and riches, it began to sense the narrowness of the needle's eye, and that rankled for a world no longer willing to believe or yearn. Jurassic Park, directed by Steven Spielberg. Sitting at the heart of my being as one of my earliest childhood memories, Jurassic Park once enraptured me through its sheer power of wonder and imagination. Though it was a movie I could not yet fully understand, I had not yet learned English and was too young to be able to keep up with the subtitles, the essence of its experience was immediately apparent and valued. Indeed, Spielberg is a filmmaker uniquely capable of telling a story through the almost universal language of sound and imagery. And his craftsmanship remains impeccable decades later. His camera work, his genius blend of practical effects with CGI, all comes together to create a cinematic reality that feels at once otherworldly and grounded, like a beautiful dream that transports you to a place beyond, yet one that nevertheless feels tactile and immersive. And I think it's precisely in that careful balance between movie magic and a real human experience, one that many other filmmakers have tried to emulate but very rarely seem to be able to achieve in the same way, that Jurassic Park, that Spielberg's entire filmography, also gains its transformative power and its multiple layers of value and meaning. For as I grew older and came to understand the full text of the movie, my appreciation for it only deepened. For besides being an entertaining man versus nature adventure, it also became clear to me that this, more than anything, is actually a tale of man's hubris. Not just in the sense as it is commonly understood, that it's about man's futile attempts to control nature, to exercise our dominion over it, which, as the movie does make unmistakably clear, is bound to result in our humbling submission in the face of the true nature of its awe-inspiring power. But I think it's also about man's hubris in the sense that we not just lack the capacity to control nature, but that we cannot even fully conceptualize it. We impose on nature a variety of categories and understandings that become the basic assumptions of our actions within it. And while it is easy to see our mistakes in that second part, in the failure to contain the consequences of our meddling, what Jurassic Park also carefully demonstrates, albeit more subtly, is that the essence of our failure lies deeper, that it stems from the assumptions we had about nature in the first place. Assumptions that, in hindsight, were overly rigid and altogether just fundamentally limited. Whether it's conceptions about different categories of species, of gender, or about our understanding of causal relationships, behavioral traits, or other biochemical processes. As Jurassic Park shows, nature will time and time again subvert our understanding of it, present some exception to every rule we impose on it, and altogether reject every attempt we make to fully encapsulate it.
Gee, the lack of humility before nature that's being displayed here staggers me.
This is the true nature of the chaos that Malcolm warns us about, though it also appears to be one that we will only learn about the hard way, looking back at the mistakes that were made by crossing a boundary we shouldn't have, instead of forward to the ones we can avoid by being more mindful of that boundary to begin with. To this end, Jurassic Park seems to leave us with this, that if we won't listen to the experts, we certainly won't be able to ignore. There Will Be Blood, directed by Paul Thomas Anderson.
I assure you, ladies and gentlemen, no matter what the others promise to do, when it comes to the showdown, they won't be there.
Daniel Day-Lewis shines as the ferocious Daniel Plainview, an ambitious and cold-hearted oilman who accumulates tremendous wealth and power in early 20th century America. I've always thought the movies of Paul Thomas Anderson had a certain literary quality to them. I still can't quite put my finger on why that is exactly, but they just feel so rich with characterizations, themes, and other layers of meaning. And here too, in what is probably his most famous work, there is an intricate rise to power not just of a man, but also of a way of life, and perhaps even of the modern world in its entirety. Though the story starts in a way that feels like the rather classical hero's journey as it has by and large been incorporated into the American dream, a man overcoming obstacles through sheer power of will and having his determination rewarded with great fortune and success, we also immediately come to understand that Plainview is not an honorable man, that his drive to success is also an obsession to win at all cost, no matter how many moral boundaries have to be crossed, and that there is an emptiness inside of him that no amount of wealth is going to fill.
I have a competition in me. I want no one else to succeed.
In short, It's the realization that There Will Be Blood is not going to end with a heroic victory, but with a tragedy. And as such, on that more metaphorical level, the movie fascinatingly captures the rise of the modern world, and of capitalistic expansion in particular, not just by showing what it added in a material sense, like the oil industry and technologies that became possible because of it, or what it gave rise to spiritually, greed, ruthlessness, but it also brings into focus that which was lost, that which slowly deteriorated in the wake of Plainview's ascension.
Say it to him. Go ahead and speak to him. It's all right.
The old world finds its encapsulation in Eli Sunday, a young preacher who seeks to grow his church and influence in the same town Plainview exploits for oil. By presenting himself as a man of faith, devotion, and community, Eli initially appears as Plainview's moral and ideological opposite, as if forming a sort of last stand against the new order. But in his story too, deeper complexities soon emerge as Anderson carefully breaks down the conflicted state of religion in a fast-changing world, and critically questions the extent to which Eli's ambition really is different from that of Plainview, or if he too is just on a self-serving quest to establish his own form of power and control. The clash between them, then, defies the simple struggle between good and evil, to instead offer a more grim reflection of the underlying will to power as it has always been a part of the American dream, striving for the dominion of land, people, and resources. The facade that Plainview offers, as the movie so violently concludes, just so happens to be a much more effective one than Eli's.
I drink your milkshake.
And yet, as cynical as all this might sound, I believe there is tremendous value in gaining a better understanding of these dynamics, and in interrogating any worldview that promises wealth, success, and heroic ascension. Because, as There Will Be Blood so timelessly demonstrates, the greatest palaces are also likely to be the most empty ones. The Big Short, directed by Adam McKay. In the late 20th century, sociologist Ulrich Beck conceptualized the idea of organized irresponsibility to characterize some of the systemic problems with our modern society. Basically, it refers to a society that functions in such a way that both no one and everyone is responsible for its failures. A sort of banality of modern evil, if you will. And in my opinion, there are few movies that capture this as captivatingly and poignantly as Adam McKay's rendition of the 2008 financial crisis does. What makes The Big Short so interesting to me is that it never lets you forget you are watching a movie. It is not a story that tries to relive the financial crisis. It is a story about the financial crisis. It's a present-day perspective looking back at a strange and highly complicated event that caused tremendous harm, to try and understand what happened and how for the sake of an audience that by and large still didn't have any real answers.
I'm guessing most of you still don't really know what happened. Yeah, you got a soundbite you repeat so you don't sound dumb, but come on.
Through a rather unique blend of staged drama, comedic satire, and documentary-style filmmaking, The Big Short tries to give us a real and transparent insight into the financial world and all the structural elements that eventually caused everything to come crashing down. The reason this is so important is because that is what gives us a deeper understanding not only of what happened, but also of how it happened. It doesn't just give us villains to point our fingers at in simple moral outrage. It also gives us a deeper understanding of why they acted the way that they did. It makes us empathize with them, which mind you is not the same as sympathizing, so that we can see the true driving force of this crisis, which wasn't a few bad apples, but a complete and systemic failure. And as such, I think this movie is not just a solid breakdown of the 2008 financial crisis, but also a fantastic insight into that concept of organized irresponsibility, or the banality of modern evil.
Yes, there's some shady shit going down, but trust me, it's fueled by stupidity.
The Big Short portrays the financial system as one that is clearly ignorant, corrupt, and destructive when viewed in its entirety, but also one where, if you zoom in, it becomes extremely difficult to pinpoint any one individual as the definitive guilty party. And even more so, as much as you would hate to admit it, it makes you realize that if you were in any of those positions, if you had those same opportunities to make easy money, if you were an employee at one of those firms, if you were a part of that environment, you would most likely have acted exactly the same. Which is perhaps the greatest achievement any movie dealing with collective behavior and human evil can aspire to hold up a mirror that not only reflects, but that also reveals. And this is exactly what The Big Short does so well. It carefully dissects how the involved power dynamics functioned, how unethical and destructive behavior was being facilitated on a structural level, and, perhaps above all, how innocent people were the ones who ended up suffering because of it. The outside world inevitably affects the inner one, and can significantly clash with the forces that were already present there. Whether through nature or nurture, we all develop certain pathologies, internal contradictions, unconscious fears, competing desires, and other mental blockades and afflictions that can disconnect us from the world around us, and that can challenge our sense of identity to the very core. Dielman, 23 Quai du Commerce, 1080 Bruxelles, directed by Chantal Akerman. It is remarkable to think about how a movie detailing such mundane everyday activities as peeling potatoes and doing chores around the house was, and still is, considered to be so radical. It reveals something important about the strange dissonance between real life and the stories we tell about it, and the expectations we have for each of them. One is fundamentally meaningful, purposeful, a carefully constructed reality intrinsically defined by deliberate design. The other is life as we know it outside of the movies, disordered, random, and profane, meaningful only insofar as we give it meaning, deliberately designed only insofar as we're willing to make a leap of faith. In this sense, it can be argued that cinema is the act of cultivating that which we most deeply long for in our own life, a story, a significance. Jeanne Dielman, however, takes a slightly different direction, yet still succeeds in conveying something profound. Jeanne Dielman is not so much about stories as it is about habits, about the routines that we inevitably slip into, and that we subsequently take for granted until something breaks and we're propelled back into a strange kind of disconnected awareness. The movie demonstrates this on its most rudimentary level. One day Jeanne wakes up earlier than regular, which means that after going through her normal daily routine, she suddenly finds herself with a spare hour, and doesn't really seem to know what to do with it. In storytelling terms, it is, needless to say, a completely unremarkable conflict, a minor happenstance that barely counts as an event. But it does point to something important as it exemplifies the deeper psychological mechanisms that so quietly yet so decisively move us through the day. The mechanisms that, somewhat paradoxically, are both a means of coping, a way to make existence manageable, as well as the source of the distress that we're trying to cope with in the first place. For Jeanne's day-to-day existence is not exactly the life of her own choosing. As a feminist landmark, the movie depicts human life, and in particular, female life, as fundamentally restricted by external constraints, ranging from cultural expectations to financial limitations, all bearing down on the individual freedom and our capacity for self-actualization. It demonstrates how casually human identity can be erased not through some dramatic act of oppression, but precisely through that quiet infiltration of mundanity, the gradual submission to repetitive structures that, over time, can alienate us from the world around us and from our own self, our own desires, hopes, and dreams. This, to me, is the essential message that Chantal Akerman wanted to convey, not just through the content of her movie, but also through the form, shaking us out of the passive expectations through which we normally consume stories and forcing us to reflect on all those subconscious mechanisms through which we limit our existence. It's a beautiful integration of method and meaning, resulting in a cinematic experience that still feels as radical as when it first released, that still contains a profound insight into the silent desperation that can hide within the everyday, and that still stands as a powerful testament to the humanity that struggles for being, even in the most invisible of places. Taxi Driver, directed by Martin Scorsese. There are movies that stand the test of time, that stay robust, and there are those that are transformed by it, that take on new meanings and are deepened by extra layers. I'm not sure how Scorsese's Taxi Driver was received back in the 70s, and by that I don't mean whether or not it got good reviews, but rather in what ways people connected to the story. Because now, almost 50 years later, its once contemporary New York setting isn't just soulful and moody, it's become unbound from time, with its dreaminess now having acquired almost mythic proportions. And as such, its story of isolation and psychological decay is not just one grounded in a specific era, as it once might have been, but one that has also become a more transcendental reflection of its own archetype, and one that, in that transformation, revealed itself to be remarkably prescient.
You talking to me? You talking to me?
Because, at its heart, Taxi Driver is a tragic tale about the interplay between isolation and self-radicalization. The story of a disturbed man who is not just lonely, but pathologically lonely, as the movie's writer Paul Schrader once noted. Meaning that though he feels like he is being alienated by a decaying modern world where human connection is as elusive as the flickering lights of passing cars, at the same time, he is also subconsciously maintaining the isolation he so deeply suffers from. As Seth Harris pointed out in his review, as much as our lonely cab driver despises the world around him, he is also fascinated and obsessed with the decay that he sees, and keeps seeking it out despite not really being forced to. And so, the profound cynicism that comes to envelop his psyche is, in part at least, the result of him actively affirming his own beliefs, which in turn furthers his isolation, which in turn strengthens his drive towards more cynicism, and on the downward spiral goes. You can probably already see the modern day parallels here. We need only replace the New York underbelly with the online landscapes of today, and the reason why Travis Bickle remains such a painfully relevant character becomes immediately obvious. More than ever, we risk going down the same path, or losing those we care about to it, which becomes especially tragic when we consider, as Scorsese also so beautifully conveys, how despite Travis becoming the architect of his own destruction, he wasn't inherently evil, he wasn't fundamentally flawed in some way that separates him from the rest of us. He genuinely wanted something different, something better for himself. Like everyone else, he desired happiness, peace of mind, a good night's sleep. Like everyone else, he yearned for love and connection, for purpose and meaning. He just stumbled along the way and got stuck in that lethal trap of bad circumstances and bad choices. And so, if there is hope to be found here, it's in that knowledge that the world doesn't fundamentally deny us goodness. It's just that we can get in our own way, get in each other's way. In fact, this is what Scorsese's extensive filmography keeps coming back to. That effort to understand how sin and evil come to inhabit our world, what societal and psychological mechanisms lead us down that road to ruin, and to let that understanding help guide us, so that we might achieve that which Travis could only dream of. Heat, directed by Michael Mann.
All I am is what I'm going after.
The epitome of style and atmosphere, a heist movie of such stature that it seemed to have become a genre of its own. Two men, two dedicated professionals existing on opposite sides of the law, propelled on a collision course towards each other with enough force to shake the foundations of both to their very core, and reveal them for what they really are. Set against the neon-lit sprawl of Los Angeles, the stark modern architecture of the city, balancing both a kind of investigative realism and a stylized heightening of mood and emotion, not only contributes to the movie's immaculate overall vibe, but also serves to amplify the contradiction of its characters, existing in a world of stimulating intensity and boundless potential that both drives their passion and purpose, yet also imprisons them in self-imposed isolation. Both Neil and Hannah sacrifice their personal lives, intimacy, and stability for what they perceive to be their true calling. A calling that demands both of them to be fully dedicated to a rigid code of honor. This strict adherence, however, also constrains them, making it impossible for either to truly connect with the world beyond their professions. And while they definitely do not share the same values, it's because they do come to acknowledge how they both share the same existential burden that a mutual respect develops in that now famous coffee shop conversation. It's that sense of self-imposed exile, of living outside the normal society by choice, and thus alone, that becomes both their bond and their tragedy. For as they also understand, their brief moment of connection cannot last, as their respective occupations will inevitably pit them against each other. When the grand confrontation eventually goes down, what we're seeing is not just one of the greatest shootouts ever filmed, but also a tragic revelation as both the cop and the outlaw unveil their true character. For neither of them, as becomes unmistakably clear, are as stoic, noble, or idealistic as they made themselves out to be. As Neil botches his escape to go after the guy who betrayed him, we realize how the criminal with the code was but a mask worn by what in reality is a brutish, impulsive man of violence who, when put under real pressure, can't let go of his base desires, and dooms himself to ruin because of it. And as Hannah skips down the hospital stairs to leave his suffering family for one last attempt to take down his nemesis, we realize how the self-sacrificing cop too was living in a pretense, the domestic life he claimed to be fighting for being but a facade he couldn't wait to escape from, a facade that was hiding the true character of a man who actively self-sabotages every relationship, every genuine connection, a man bound to end up alone. This, to me, is the true tragedy that Heat so masterfully captures. Not just the cost of ideals or the price of dedicating yourself to a singular purpose, but the destructive power of the unreflective self that, in its struggle for meaning, can blind itself to its true driving forces, thereby causing chaos instead of establishing order, breaking bonds instead of forging them, and just generally leaving us empty instead of fulfilled. Grizzly Man, directed by Werner Herzog.
Hey, who's stealing that hat? Man.
Herzog has always had a knack for finding fascinating subjects for his documentaries. In Grizzly Man, that subject is Timothy Treadwell, an eccentric activist who got himself killed by the same bears he sought to protect. The irony of Treadwell's fate, at least from a dramatic perspective, is immediately obvious, and might even invite blatant mockery. But Herzog saw something deeper in his story, a strange character who he will philosophically disagree with, sure, but also a kind of kindred spirit, a filmmaker on a quest to bring us into an unseen world. And indeed, there are many shots here, filmed by Treadwell himself during his many one-man expeditions into bear territory, that are quite remarkable, and Herzog never misses the opportunity to point that out.
There is something like an inexplicable magic of cinema.
But it's in that poetic gaze that he also highlights the discrepancy between the human psyche and the natural world, the gap between what we subjectively experience and what is objectively so. For Treadwell, all had clearly melted into one, His love for bears equaled the conviction that bears are loving, that in their untamed beauty, these animals represented some form of higher truth and salvation. This is where Herzog doesn't refrain from chiming in with his own perspective, one that sees nature as indifferent, hostile, eternally in murderous conflict with itself and with us. As he so endearingly narrates, staring into the faces of all the bears that Treadwell ever filmed, he discovers no kinship, no understanding, no mercy, no secret world of the bears.
And this blank stare speaks only of a half-bored interest in food.
Instead of simply pushing his worldview over Treadwell's, however, Herzog uses their disagreement to spark a broader discussion on the boundaries between man and nature. Where do we draw the line between human idealism and objective fact? How do we let it inform our actions? How do we balance our relation to the natural world? Where and how do we intervene without transgressing too far? Who decides between right and wrong when it is we ourselves who came up with the construct to begin with? But more than that, Grizzly Man is also just a human story. And while Herzog doesn't hesitate to point out the flaws in Treadwell's philosophy, the man himself, and those who knew him, he treats with dignity. Through interviews with Treadwell's friends and family, we come to better understand the actual person behind the Grizzly Man persona. A human being who is just trying to belong, and who, after having struggled to exist in a society that, in his view, offered nothing but disappointment, pain and rejection, found purpose and meaning as the self-appointed protector of bears. And so, while Treadwell may stand as a cautionary tale of that yearning for significance, in the end, Herzog does not depict a figure of ridicule or pity, but one of profound complexity. A beautifully tragic example of the collision between human idealism and an indifferent world, which, as Herzog has so often affirmed throughout his filmography, is where the true story of who we are really emerges. Inception, directed by Christopher Nolan. Dreams within dreams. Right from the opening scene, Nolan immediately communicates to us that this is a movie where you are going to have to keep your eyes open and critically question the reality of what you're watching. And yet, the ontological uncertainty, the interrogation of what is real, is but a means to an end. It is a mechanism that works its way into the depths of our unconscious mind. And in what is arguably his magnum opus, Nolan brings us along in the act of deception. Despite being wrapped within the trappings of an action-packed science fiction heist movie, Inception is a groundbreakingly complex but also surprisingly emotional journey into the human mind. Our struggle to comprehend the reality of our world, of ourselves, and of the connections between them, all the while being trapped within a limited subjective perspective. The philosopher Søren Kierkegaard distinguished between objective and subjective truth, with objective truth referring to the factual, to the knowledge that stands apart from the individual observer, and subjective truth referring more to the way that knowledge is appropriated, valued, and integrated into the life of the observer, thereby transforming it into something that is deeply connected to them, and that relates specifically to their individuality. It's the idea that sticks, and it's this kind of truth, as Kierkegaard argued and as Inception also seems to posit, that is more important than we generally assume, not in a factual way but in an existential one, as that which ultimately motivates our actions and defines who we are.
Once an idea has taken hold in the brain, it's almost impossible to eradicate. An idea that is fully formed, fully understood, that sticks. Right in there somewhere.
In this sense, the science fiction concept of Inception articulates directly what we all experience indirectly. It asks us to think about our own psychological realities. How have we been incepted? What are the parasitic ideas wreaking havoc in our minds? Can you confront the convictions that are locked away in your subconsciousness? Can you face what's hiding in the basement of your inner being? All the emotions, memories, ideas and traumas that are truly driving you, that are truly defining who you are. And from here, can you decide what really matters? Can you commit to an idea that lacks objective certainty but that is nevertheless existentially significant specifically to you? Can you take that leap of faith?
Come back, so we can be young men together again.
What makes Inception such a modern classic is that it's not just a thought-provoking and entertaining blockbuster. It's also a beautiful affirmation of human beings as complicated emotional beings. It acknowledges and brings explicit awareness to the notion that our consciousness is greater than our rational mind, greater than a logically ordered aggregate of our thoughts, beliefs, and memories. We all experience the world subjectively, and we all struggle to determine what is real, what is important. And beyond being a matter of individual psychology, it's a relational issue too, as Nolan emphasizes in the movie's symphonic ending, and as he comes back to throughout his filmography. We allow our world to function because we collectively put our trust in it, because we choose to believe it is real. This is the defining factor in Cobb's victory. It's not just a reconciliation with his own inner being, but also the establishment of a new harmony between him, his friends, and his loved ones who, after being separated by incompatible beliefs and conflicting realities, are now finally on the same plane of existence again. A new collectively agreed upon reality from which life is possible.
Lastly, I want to talk about morality and virtue, and about the movies that, in many ways, form the culmination of everything that came before. Movies that exist on the intersection of existence, of passion and love, humanity and justice. But perhaps most of all, movies that have inspired me with hope, and that have given me ideals to strive towards. I could elaborate on this in more detail, but in short, these are the movies that simply make me want to be a better person.
It's a Wonderful Life, directed by Frank Capra. Though mostly known, and rightfully so, as a Christmas classic, I've always found that It's a Wonderful Life is also so much more than that. Not just a nostalgic trip back to a simpler time and a simpler story that is relatable and enjoyable because we watch it during that one time of the year where we collectively allow ourselves to relish in nostalgia and tradition. But a prescient tale that captured a distinctive movement in modern society that would only become more impactful in the decades that followed, and which might just be the real reason why we still cherish so deeply the heartwarming story of George Bailey. Because it's here that we not only find a diagnosis to many of the struggles we are facing today, but also, in some ways, a remedy or an anchor through which we can recenter ourselves.
I'm going out exploring someday. You watch.
Through the life of George Bailey, we see the clash between the growing move towards individualization, that exciting sentiment that we are able to break free from our roots and truly author a life of our own.
I want to do something big and something important.
And the reality of a world in which we always remain bound to others, and in which our conceived freedom always ends up being restricted by circumstances. No wonder George experiences so much frustration, and even feels his life is a failure. For if the individual is assumed to be capable of mastering the whole of their lives on their own, are his unrealized dreams not his own fault? Was it not his own lack of determination that prevented him from chasing after his own goals? Is his solidarity to his community, his continued selflessness not but a weakness in this new world where the self comes first and foremost, where there is no place for people like George? No, it's time for an intervention. As Clarence guides George through a world without him, a world without his qualities, we come to understand how George not only lost sight of his own worth, but just as much, if not more so, of that of those around him. Lost sight of the plain and simple truth that was right there all along. That, in spite of the pressing weight of individualism, greed and selfishness, of the forces that make it so easy to feel like you're all alone and without power, George actually had everything he ever needed all along. Family, friends, community, people that he could rely on, especially in times of need. The only real mistake was his failure to see that, to consider that those people and circumstances he felt so burdened by are actually a source of strength and of meaning, and that the idea of his entire community coming together to help him was not some miracle he could never hope for, but an obvious response he could have counted on, as he has already throughout his life. For that brief glimpse into a world that never was didn't just serve to see what George had done for those around him, but also to understand what they had done for him, and to appreciate all the sacrifices they made on his behalf, taking form in these small, almost unremarkable acts of kindness that are so easily taken for granted, yet that nevertheless fill our lives with security, connection, and warmth.
Little present from old man Gowa. Came down and picked it out himself. He did?
It's these qualities, these basic human traits that, when truly considered in their totality, are just as redeeming and life-affirming as calling to the heavens and bringing down a literal angel to tell us that indeed, no man is a failure who has friends. Ikiru, directed by Akira Kurosawa. Though the promise of death sits at the very premise of our existence, we somehow seem to brush it aside as if it isn't. It's a coping mechanism that works until it doesn't, at which point the full weight of not just our impending fate, but also of the life that is preceding it can overwhelm us as if we're just learning about it for the first time. This is exactly what happens to Watanabe, a wary bureaucrat who learns he has terminal cancer, and is devastated not just by the fact that he will soon be gone, but also by the realization that he hadn't been truly alive to begin with. He reflects back on the decades spent merely existing, virtually numb to either sadness or joy, hope or despair, just a cog in a hopelessly inefficient governmental machine, which here stands symbol for all the mechanisms, external and internal, that reduce the fullness of our humanity to automated systems and routines, devoid of passion and empathy, and that trap us in a lifeless existence of mundane tasks and empty responsibilities. The renewed awakening, then, sparks a quest for life, and more than that, for meaning. For though he initially tries to drown his fears and find pleasure in the nightlife of Tokyo, the hedonistic flight leaves him feeling hollow. Kurosawa has always been a humanist at heart, the heroes of his stories always finding true purpose and fulfillment in their dedication to others. And Watanabe too eventually finds such a path in his attempt to bring into being a children's playground, a project that had been hanging in bureaucratic limbo forever. It demonstrates how, when infused with some genuine passion and will, those same mechanisms designed to dull our lives and our world can be brought into motion and employed to actually achieve something meaningful, to actually make a difference, both for others and for ourselves. Instead of ending on this positive and empowering note, however, Kurosawa makes an interesting turn in the latter half of the movie where our perspective shifts away from the dying man and towards his younger colleagues who are now reflecting on his legacy. There's a certain tragicness here as, in their reminiscing, they initially find great meaning in what the old bureaucrat was able to achieve, and seem inspired to follow his example, to become true servants of the people. But when the next day comes around and the wheels of the machine start turning again, the flame that was lit appears to be quickly extinguished. It's a painful reminder that while we might be easily riled up by sentiment, putting in the actual work, making that actual change, is something else. And yet, it's this added layer of complexity, of difficulty, that to me, in some strange way, makes the final message of Ikiru all the more uplifting, for it recognizes the nuances of awareness, the sort of ebb and flow of inspiration, and within that framework shows us the subtle power of action, even if only exercised on a small scale and for a brief moment. As Kurosawa seems to say here, we don't have to change the world, we don't have to become perfect saints, but if we truly want to find some meaning in life, we do have to be willing to act, to engage the human need that surrounds us, and commit ourselves to their cause. The Shawshank Redemption, directed by Frank Darabont. When I think of the idea of a movie being more than the sum of its parts, the first example that usually comes to mind is The Shawshank Redemption. Watching it now, there's an interesting stacking of nostalgic elements. A mid-century setting invoking the quaintness and apparent simplicity of that bygone era, infused with the sincerity of 90s filmmaking sensibilities. Combined with its beautiful photography, a score that has no business being as moving and impactful as it is, and the evocative narration by Morgan Freeman guiding us throughout. The inner confines of the stark grey walls that surround the Shawshank prison are transformed into an almost otherworldly realm. And it is here, out of place and out of time, where there unfolds a profound tale of friendship, purpose, and hope. From the moment that Andy Dufresne, a former banker sentenced to life in prison for a crime he didn't commit, steps into Shawshank, he stands out like a sore thumb. Calm, quiet, and reserved, he is described by his fellow prisoner Red as having a walk and talk that just isn't normal around there. He strolled, like a man in a park without a care or worry in the world, Red narrates, like he had on an invisible coat that would shield him from this place. And in some ways, he did, though it wasn't some magical item that protected him. Rather, it was a specific disposition, a stoic philosophy of life that separated him from most other inmates. One that, seeing how it dates back to ancient times and has remained relevant ever since, contains a timeless universality, yet also one that, despite this timeless universality, is rare to find in such an inspiring and pure form in cinema.
There's something inside that they can't get to, that they can't touch. It's yours.
Stoicism, or at least its modern interpretation, is centered around a few basic tenets, with the first and most famous being the act of distinguishing what is within our control and what is not. Andy can't control his fate, nor his reputation, but his reactions, his attitude and effort are his, a fundamental freedom that cannot be imprisoned, and that fuels him with hope and purpose where others fall into despair and apathy. For to know where your power lies is to be able to live purposefully and meaningfully, to be able to work towards something even when the outcome of that goal is uncertain. Let all your efforts be directed to something, let it keep that end in view. The Stoic philosopher Seneca once wrote, "It's not activity that disturbs people, but false conceptions of things that drive them mad." And more than that, it's not just an individual matter, it's a relational issue too. To quote Seneca again, "If wisdom were offered to me on the one condition that I should keep it shut away and not divulge it to anyone, I should reject it. There's no enjoying the possession of anything valuable unless one has someone to share it with." Indeed, as Andy so perfectly demonstrates, the redemption that follows from all this is not just his, but spreads throughout the Shawshank prison, where it transcends from the mere freeing of an imprisoned body to the liberation of the soul and the beautiful reunion of two old friends. The Lord of the Rings, directed by Peter Jackson. Probably the defining movie-going experience of my childhood, both in the sense that this was a story that captivated me unlike any other, as well as one that became a significant source of moral inspiration during those formative years. To watch The Lord of the Rings, and yes, I'm discussing the entire trilogy as one big movie here, is to venture into the world of the human heart, the human soul, one in which the apparent moral simplicity between light and dark, between the good guys and the forces of evil, by virtue of mythological transportation, are effectively transformed into a much more complicated yet absolutely timeless conflict about freedom, responsibility, and hope. In some ways even, The Lord of the Rings functions as a theodicy, as an attempt to explain the presence of evil, violence, and suffering in this world, while also making a case for why one should aspire to virtue and goodness nevertheless. At first glance, Tolkien's premise seems to suggest a world in which evil is the more powerful force, an all-devouring shadow that will eventually cover all. In contrast, goodness appears fragile, easily forsaken, and ultimately futile in this grand movement towards death and demise. The One Ring captures this existential struggle into a single object. To resist its temptation as an individual is but one personal victory in a world that's still slipping into darkness. While at the same time, if that same person does succumb to its power, then all of the world would be doomed. How do we position ourselves against this imbalance, against this aggressive force that's pressing onto that which can either hold or break, but which cannot seem to fight back? Well, as our heroes go on to demonstrate, hope is not just an individual trait that a person can acquire or lose. It is also a function of the world. It's a tangible force that works our collective being, and as such, it's not a passive act, it's an active defiance. And more than that, it is consequential. There is good in this world, as Sam puts it.
And it's worth fighting for.
Whereas the ring and the kind of evil it represents ultimately proves itself to be nothing more than isolating, a dark, lonely vacuum. Those who hope do so together and become emboldened in each other's presence. The one thing that is demanded of us is to take responsibility for our own agency, our own capacity to do what is right, and to take a leap of faith, to put our trust in our own virtues and in those of others. In this sense, to hope is to commit ourselves to a cause with an uncertain outcome. But of course, in Tolkien's philosophy, that's where our power lies, not in the assurance of a certain end, but in the means by which we aspire towards it, by taking part in the battle, regardless if it ends in victory or defeat. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us. Throughout this long, beautiful tale, we are continuously reminded of how the smallest of sparks can spread a fire across mountains, how the courage of a few can move entire armies, and how even the tiniest act of goodness and virtue can yield a power that reaches far beyond our individuality, and that, in the end, though we may not always directly perceive it as such, becomes strong enough to keep the darkness at bay. Kingdom of Heaven, directed by Ridley Scott. The director's cut of Kingdom of Heaven is not just a sprawling historical epic standing firm amongst the finest adventure movies ever made, but it's also a masterpiece of moral philosophy. Our story begins with Balian, a simple blacksmith mourning the death of his wife and questioning the principles of his faith. More essentially, though, he is a character in search of goodness and virtue. What man is a man who does not make the world better? He has engraved in his workshop. Through a series of events, some fortunate, others less so, Balian is embraced by a group of knights on their way to Jerusalem, where he finds a renewed sense of purpose in the moral code of the knighthood, and in the arid piece of land he seeks to transform into something better and more beautiful. As he steps into this new world, however, he also steps into a new political game, one that, as he quickly discovers, is corrupted by religious grandiosity, deception, and violence. Caught between competing claims to the Holy Land, Balian eventually gets swallowed up in conflict and war, and this perhaps is where his true test begins, as the dying King Baldwin, one of the last remaining vessels for peace and reason, reminds him, whatever Balian chooses to do, his soul is in his keeping alone, and that when he stands before God, he cannot say,
"But I was told by others to do thus, or that virtue was not convenient at the time. This will not suffice."
In other words, the movie presents us with, and explores the implications of, rule-based systems of ethics, which propose that there are certain principles or golden rules that we must adhere to regardless of the cost or outcome. It's a kingdom of conscience, or nothing, as the movie at one point summarizes it. As he embraces this aspiration towards pure conscience, Balian puts himself on a collision with the world around him that doesn't follow his moral code, but instead seems to be driven by a more utilitarian perspective, one in which the means matter less than the end that is achieved, and one in which most people, to varying degrees, seem to be willing to commit some evil in order to achieve a greater good.
There must be war. God wills it!
Though goal-oriented systems of ethics are not without their value, and therefore aren't fully dismissed here as being inherently problematic, Kingdom of Heaven does want us to consider how easily they can be corrupted, how easily the idea of a greater good can become little more than an excuse, a self-justification for the committing of evil, which leaves us wondering if it ever was anything more than a false belief trapping us in an unending cycle of destruction and violence. As we see one conflict setting up another, and man's grandiosity and violent potential being passed down from one generation to the next, the manifestation of the Kingdom of Heaven does seem ever so far on the horizon. But then again, the flame of Balian's moral code is also still alive and burning, and from this principled perspective, there is the more hopeful argument that if a better world lives only for a little while, however small and however brief, at least it will have lived. As promised at the beginning, there's a few more things I want to talk about here. First off, you can find the full list on Letterboxd. I'll include a link for that in the description. Furthermore, I have some honorable mentions, some other notes on the somewhat paradoxical struggle to make a definitive canon in a cinematic landscape that's never static. But before I get into that, I first want to remind you that this list was first and foremost born out of a love for cinema, and out of a lifetime of exploring movies from different eras and from all around the world. It is a passion that is as alive as ever, and that's why, after many years, I'm still such a great fan of Mubi, the curated online cinema streaming exceptional movies from around the world. Slight spoiler warning, but next month I'm releasing my end of the year video in which I reflect back on my favorite movies of 2024, and I can already tell you there's gonna be some exclusive movie releases on there. In the meantime, they've also expanded their short films Big Names collection, which, as the title suggests, features a variety of short movies from well-known filmmakers such as David Lynch, Yorgos Lanthimos, and Jonathan Glazer. And I also have to mention their stunning 4K restoration of The Fall, which is just an amazingly beautiful movie that not enough people have seen. Needless to say, there's a lot here to enjoy. Mubi has a vast library of amazing movies from newly emerging filmmakers as well as from established masters, with each and every one of them being carefully hand-selected to provide you with the best that cinema has to offer. And if you want to start exploring these movies for yourself, then be sure to use my personal link, that's mubi.com/likestoriesofold, to get 30 days for free. Again, that's mubi.com/likestoriesofold to start your extended free trial today. Okay, now back to the list. let's start with the why of it. Why make yet another list of movies? Well, it was actually requested by a lot of you. Over the years, a lot of fans have asked me for my top list or my overview of the best movies ever made, and I initially had set this as a goal on my Patreon page. You know, that when you reach an X amount of supporters, I'd make a giant video about my favorite movies. But then Patreon removed that function and I decided to just make it anyways. And as I explained in the beginning, I thought it would be interesting to organize it into categories of meaning, because for me at least, that's how I tend to think about movies anyways. Like in my head, I don't see Tarkovsky's The Mirror as my 4th or 5th favorite movie or whatever. No, I see it as a movie that really used the means of cinema to explore the structure of our consciousness and the way it floats through time and memory in search of meaning. I also just don't like the idea of lists that only pit movies against each other by forcing them into some arbitrary ranking which then becomes the main focus point of discussion. I'm sure that even with this list there's gonna be some arguments about movies that should or should not have been there, but the great thing about this approach, I think, is that it's made to be non-exhaustive. Like, you can not only add movies to the established categories, which I absolutely encourage you to do, by the way, but perhaps even more interestingly is that you can add entirely new categories. Add your own theme or sphere of meaning within which certain movies were important or transformative for you. If I ever choose to expand this list, that's probably what I'll do. Which is also a good segue into some honorable mentions, because there were a number of obviously great movies that didn't make it onto the list simply because I couldn't quite fit them into the categories I came up with. Classic movies like The Godfather, Lawrence of Arabia, Casablanca and Seven Samurai are absolute masterpieces. But they just weren't quite as transformative for me when seen through that specific lens of personal meaningfulness. There were also movies like Gladiator, Malik's The New World or Martin Scorsese's Silence that didn't make the list because I already had other picks that more or less conveyed the same themes. Gladiator, for example, would probably have been in the goodness and virtue category were it not for the Shawshank Redemption already having the same stoic themes, which I think Gladiator also had. And because of the fact that Ridley Scott also made Kingdom of Heaven, which at this point in time has just become such a beloved favorite of mine. Lastly, there were some movies that I really loved but which got left out because they were just too recent and I wanted to wait and see if they really stood the test of time. I loved Aftersun, for example. Anatomy of a Fall was really good, and so was Tar and The Zone of Interest. And I also still think Oppenheimer is going to age in an interesting way. But I guess time will tell. I actually made a graph showing the number of movies per decade, and as you can see, there still is a clear bias towards newer movies, mostly from the 2000s and 2010s. But it also makes sense considering those were my formative years, both as a kid and as an adult. And so it's only natural that the movies that came out during that time were the most impactful. And who knows, maybe as I'll get older, the distribution will shift again, which leads into another reason I wanted to make this list, because though I acknowledge that the whole idea of making a definitive overview of the most meaningful movies ever made is to some extent a futile effort, I also like the idea of capturing a certain moment in time or cementing something that I can look back on later as a sort of anchoring point. Like in this year and at this age, these were the movies and the categories I considered to be the most important. But 10 or 20 years from now, I might feel entirely different about it, and by having made this list, I like that I will now be able to measure that evolution or transformation to some extent. Because again, cinema is an ever-changing landscape, just as we are ever-changing beings, which to me is what makes the relationship between the two so exciting. They just feed so well into each other, you know? Movies change people, changed people make different movies, and the cycle continues. Thank you to everyone who has supported my work over the years. This video really was for all of you. Be sure to claim that extended free trial for Mubi, and now go watch some good movies.